Roll over Churchill. Why Brexit had to happen. By Arend Heinlein. If you ask the British who the most popular politician of recent decades is, only one name comes to mind: Sir Winston Spencer Churchill, 1874 to 1965. He is the man who recognized the National Socialist danger as early as the beginning of the 1930s, who led Great Britain in the war against Germany, who allied himself with his opponent Stalin and urged his friend Roosevelt to enter the war, the man who gave the order to bomb Hamburg and Dresden. Such esteem may embitter the Germans who, after reading Georg Friedrich's The Fire, are calling for a war crimes tribunal against Britain in general and its great Prime Minister in particular, but this bitterness is unfounded because the mood in Britain is changing. Churchill's popularity in the British Isles is increasingly reduced to patriotic memories of heroic times when they stood together and won against a mighty enemy. His political principles are being called into question, as is the conduct of the war for which he was responsible, particularly the bombing campaign against Germany. Tony Blair, who seems to have followed the great example and led Great Britain into the war against Iraq alongside the USA, is far more a descendant of the European coalition of appeasement with Nazi Germany than a politician who, in the tradition of Churchill, wants to combat the global danger and, as a partner in advance with the United States, is also militarily available for a new world order against old Europe and its Islamic allies. His German biographers, from Sebastian Haffner to Christian Graf von Krakow, were never comfortable with Hitler's staunchest opponent. A representative of the traditionally conservative political class of his country, the gentry, who defended the empire throughout his life as a politician against anti-colonialists in his own country and as a young soldier in the colonies, also militarily, who worked as a minister in various departments and finally almost single-handedly swore his country into war against the Germans as a gifted rhetorician in parliament and in public, he of all people should have led Europe to freedom, prosperity and bourgeois democracy through this war? He did. And this is precisely what, with all due respect to the East Pomeranian Count for the English Sir, makes Krakow speculate on his behalf. What would have become of him in other circumstances? What in Spain or Italy, in Russia, in Germany, if one thinks of his aptitude for political struggle, his will to power, his demagogic abilities, his inclination towards warlike adventures? A duce, a dictator, a leader of tyranny. End of quote. This denunciatory question, borrowed from Ernst Nolte's arsenal of world civil warriors, does, however, make sense when put differently. What would the vegetarian, animal rights activist, traffic route planner and dog psychologist Adolf Hitler have become under different circumstances, in England or the USA, for example? Probably not much more than a drifter or vagrant whose traditional political seat would not have been the grandstand at the conference of his country's largest political party, but a handy wooden box at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. This alone makes all the difference. Churchill, unlike Hitler, was a staunch parliamentarian. He was an elected member of Parliament for a total of 60 of his 91 years and found an audience and a stage in this capacity. It was in Parliament and not on the battlefield that he experienced his bitterest defeats, the most serious in 1938, when he became a parliamentary outsider because of his uncompromising anti-German line. As early as 1932, he saw the Germans as the enemy and Hitler as the soon-to-be strong man. Quote, "I knew little of his doctrine or his history and nothing of his character. I have nothing against people who stand up for their country in defeat, even if I am in the opposite camp." End quote. Instead of ridiculing his opponent in the bad left-wing tradition, where danger emanates from him, and thus underestimating his success until it is too late, the conservative Churchill took his enemy seriously. He meticulously studied the development of Germany, traveled to Bavaria and Berlin and met with close associates of Hitler. He was one of the first British politicians to read Mein Kampf, and was probably the only one to recognize the real danger. Hitler, Churchill judged, was not a politician and certainly not a statesman, but an ideologue and murderer. In the years 33 to 38, he tirelessly warned against this sinister power, which in its advance intoxicates itself with a barbaric paganism, boasts of its lust for aggression and conquest, draws strength and perverse pleasure from persecution, and, as we have seen, uses the threat of murderous violence with merciless brutality. End quote. Against the declared will of his own party, the Tories, Churchill called for the expansion of naval forces, the creation of a strong air force and the early creation of civil and military alliances against Nazi Germany in vain. When Hitler's troops invaded Austria in March 1938, the first step towards Greater Germany had been taken. France and Great Britain reacted with indignant compliance, according to the derisive comment of Italian Foreign Minister Count Ciano. 6 months later, British Prime Minister Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Daladier met with Hitler and Mussolini in Munich. They believed Hitler, who had declared in a radio address on the planned occupation of Czechoslovakia shortly beforehand, "It is the last territorial demand I have to make in Europe, but it is also the demand from which I will not waver and which, God willing, I will fulfill." End quote. As is well known, Great Britain and France gave Hitler a free hand, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain was celebrated at home as the keeper of peace. As late as February 1945, Hitler went on record in the bunker under the crumbling Reich Chancellery what only the foreign policy experts of the Soviet Union, apart from himself and Winston Churchill, apparently knew, although their boss saw just as little reason for anti-fascist motivated rearmament as Chamberlain. Quote, "The war had to be waged in 1938. That was the last opportunity to localize the war. But they accepted everything. Like weaklings they gave in to all my demands. Under such conditions, it was indeed difficult to start a war." End quote. When Churchill's prophecies came true a short time later and Germany turned the whole of Europe into a battlefield, the British were reminded of Cassandra. Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Peace, resigned and Churchill became the new Prime Minister. Thereafter, it was long undisputed between Portsmouth and Shetland that, even if the British Empire was not under immediate and direct threat, tyrants and murderers had to be confronted early and appeasement policy had to be a finite one. After all, Hitler's regime had already threatened, annexed and murdered in 1938, and a military strike at that time would no longer have been a preventive one. Tony Blair, who has long presented himself as Little Churchill, has nothing in common with his presumed foster father. If he supports or actually wages wars, then either the wrong ones or the right ones with the wrong arguments. In the war against Yugoslavia, he pulled out the human rights card like only the Germans, preached the rights of ethnic peoples and thus convinced the very British who wanted to bring him down this spring with these very folkish arguments. Together with the Americans and the continental Europeans, above all the up-and-coming Germany, Blair's England also used fighter bombers to launch a military strike in the wake of the German policy of recognition. As is well known, this war coalition broke up after September 11, 2001. While the USA has since been trying to force through a new world order for its own protection and to safeguard its interests, which is to be based on principles that are not coincidentally reminiscent of Churchill's, Blair entered into practical competition with Chirac and Schroeder rather than agreeing with Bush on a new order against the Franco-German impositions of old Europe. In the case of Iraq, Blair once again pulled out the anti-totalitarianism card, which had to be shown to alleged or actual tyrants today, but even before the war was over, he stabbed his partner in leadership in the back by wanting to involve the UN and old Europe, of all things, in the administration of post-Saddam Iraq. Unlike Blair, Churchill also had shock and awe on offer for the British. If Hitler was not eliminated, then the British Isles would perish in the grip of German anti-civilization. More and more Britons realized that this conviction was correct and strengthened Churchill against the overpowering British appeasement camp of the 1930s. Blair cannot convey such a horror scenario today. The attempt to constantly sell a distant dictator as a Hitler-compatible threat to Britain fails to convince British peace demonstrators. Their old left question of what the British Army was doing on distant continents was never answered conclusively by Blair, unlike Bush. No wonder, then, that those who advocate the right to self-determination for tyrants were ideologically in the ascendancy, even though Churchill had already declared, "We in this country, like the inhabitants of other liberal and democratic countries, have the full right to uphold the principle of self-determination." But it looks bad in the mouths of people in totalitarian states who refuse even the smallest degree of toleration to any group or sentiment within their own borders. End quote. Unlike Churchill, Tony Blair can no longer communicate a master plan. He is too caught between America and Europe. His ever-changing justifications for the war against Iraq appear too questionable. The left liberal opinion makers of The Guardian and Independent ask, not without good reason, whether Blair's transatlantic balancing act serves solely to be a global player in both power blocks, the supposedly falling American and the supposedly rising European one. As a pragmatic politician, Churchill placed the social question at the center of his work from an early age. From 1908, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he pursued what today would be called good social democratic policies. He founded the British Employment Service, introduced unemployment insurance, cut military funding in peacetime and introduced progressive income tax and a drastic inheritance tax. In addition to foreign policy confrontation with totalitarian regimes, Churchill's master plan always included domestic pacification. This did not mean the modern folkish social partnership as in Germany, for the location and against the welfare state. On the contrary, during the Second World War, there were already plans in the London All-Party Coalition to further expand the British class compromise after the dark years of the war. The Labour Party that came to power in the late 1940s built on this. The tradition of the welfare state initiated by Churchill was buried by Blair's Social Democratic Party of all parties. He brought Thatcher's dirty job to an end. The British Isles' health and social services have been slashed to a minimum of basic social security. Churchill's Sacred Heart socialism lies dead in the ground with him. Churchill's master plan on how to shape a late capitalist society worked for a long time. The socio-political internal pacifications served to identify the British with the Western values of freedom and democracy. Churchill's soldiers knew not only what they were going to war against, but also what they were going to war for. This master plan is now anachronistic. The welfare state has been abolished and political morality is limited to a strategic calculation, but the folkish card, which was and is so successful in continental Europe, still doesn't work on the British Isles. Until 1939, Churchill was regarded by the British as a penetrating doomsayer. After the years 1914 to 18, people across all social classes had had enough of the war. The British wanted nothing to do with Franco's Spain or the disastrous fascist Berlin-Rome axis. While Churchill called for rearmament and intervention, the British pushed for their own disarmament. In addition to cooperating with Stalin, who was still Hitler's reliable ally until the summer of 1941, Churchill had another decision to make. He gave the order to bomb various major German cities from 1943 onwards. This was not, as he was so often accused of, about revenge for Coventry and London, even though Churchill walked through the ruins of the British capital weeping after German attacks and pondered a way out. He wanted to achieve in Germany what Hitler had failed to do in Britain: demoralize the enemy by taking the war from the distant front to the cities. Churchill later admitted with disappointment that the results of our attacks fell short of the objectives. He had not suspected that the horrors of the bombing nights could do so little to the German mania. Despite all the German and anti-German discussions, the principle of moral bombing was only of secondary importance. More important was the fact that Great Britain had every reason to believe that the Nazis not only wanted to occupy the island, but to smash it. Hitler had made this clear to the Reichstag in July 1940, and Mr. Churchill should believe me this time, for once, when I say the following as a prophet: a great world empire will be destroyed as a result. Only I am aware that the continuation of this struggle will only end with the complete destruction of one of the two combatants. Mr. Churchill may believe that it will be Germany. I know it will be England." End quote. A successful ground war against the Germans was hopeless for a long time. The troops were too small, landing technology and tanks were only in production, and the Americans were far too late to get actively involved. Targeted bombing of the German armaments industry, for example, was impossible for the British. Carrying out targeted attacks at low level during the day had already led to massive losses for the Royal Air Force during the first attempts. The only effective weapon the British had was nighttime area bombing. Churchill himself later wrote, "We forced the enemy into an ever-increasing but ultimately inadequate air defense, which took up a considerable part of his war effort." End quote. By taking the war into the German hinterland, the British created a decisive relief on the Eastern and later the Western Front, which made it possible for the Allied ground troops to advance in the first place. In this sense, the strategic bombing of the major German cities was as necessary as it was successful. Heinrich Heine wrote enthusiastically and hopefully about the revolution of philosophy in early 19th century Germany: "Thought precedes action, like lightning precedes thunder." The German thunder is, of course, also German and is not only very agile and comes rolling along somewhat slowly, but it will come, and when you hear it crack one day, as it has never cracked before in world history, then know, the German thunder has finally reached its goal. End of quote. Churchill probably sensed exactly this, albeit in reverse. German ideas, when they break through, become a thunderstorm. Hitler's Mein Kampf was such a German idea, and it threatened to become a political reality. And yet the opinion prevailed in the British Isles that the most that could be done against Germany was to impose economic sanctions. The instrument of this containment policy was to be the League of Nations. Even if one keeps in mind all the enormous differences between Nazi Germany and Botha Rock, a few analogies come to mind. The League of Nations containment strategy towards a murderous regime failed in 1939, just as the UN's did in 1991 FF. In 1938, Churchill remarked about Czechoslovakia in connection with its occupation and destruction: "It has had to atone in that way for having joined the democracies of the West and the League of Nations, which it has always faithfully served." End quote. As much as Churchill was committed to multilateral alliances, as much as he was a friend of the League of Nations and a mastermind of the United States of Europe, he clearly drew the consequences from the failure of the paper tiger and stood up against Nazi Germany with an armed coalition of the willing. Today, the UN has failed just as completely in the fight against Saddam's regime as the League of Nations once did. Blair's debacle in the UN Security Council was brilliant. Now he has briefly turned his back on such illustrious peace activists as Russia, Germany and Syria in order to stand by America's side once again in this campaign. But even before Basra and Baghdad were under Allied control, he was already arguing with Bush about the role of the UN. The FAZ is pleased when the British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw writes under the title For a Better Europe, that it should be examined how we can use the European Union as a force to persuade the United States to work within rather than outside the multilateral system that we all hold so dear. End quote. The British Foreign Secretary thus stabbed his own war coalition in the back and confirmed the anti-American resentment of old Europe. Early on, Churchill saw America as the best partner for military engagement against Germany. He did not trust the Europeans, considering them either too weak or too cowardly. Even as head of the Admiralty, months before he became Prime Minister, he therefore contacted Roosevelt. In almost 1,000 letters and messages during the war, he urged the American president, who had long been blocked by the domestic peace camp, to join forces and fight decisively against Germany. Churchill, writes Timothy Garton Ash in The Guardian, was not alone in being a great warlord. Aware of Britain's rapidly declining power, he made a strategic decision. This was the special relationship with the United States to help us do the things we could no longer do on our own. End quote. This Anglo-American alliance became a model for success, which Blair also followed for a long time. At the beginning of the Iraq War, he attacked the British and continental European peace movement with the words, "People who want to divide Europe and America are playing one of the most dangerous games in international politics." End quote. Blair was the first European politician to visit Bush in the United States after he came to power. They met at Camp David, a symbolic place for the American-British partnership. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill had met here during the Second World War and planned the war against Germany. "Just as you Americans stood with us during the Second World War, we stand with you now," declared Blair shortly after the attacks on New York and Washington. He meant it. British solidarity did not end after just a few days. There are various reasons why the British are now increasingly distancing themselves from the Americans. When the American presidential advisor Richard Pearl makes it clear that the Americans will not allow themselves to be talked into major decisions, this hits the nerve of British inferiority complexes towards the United States. As Pearl stated at the end of 2001, ultimately, we will do what we think is right. And the United States will not give a damn about European sensibilities. End of quote. In British opposition circles, such sovereign statements are met with offensive and insinuating comparisons, such as those made by left-wing Blair critic James Galloway when he declares that Anglo-American relations should be different from those between Miss Lewinsky and President Clinton, one-sided, grotesquely unequal, and with the weaker partner always on his knees. End quote. Galloway thus speaks from the soul of many who see in the presumably Americanophile policies of Blair and Straw, without which neither the coalition of the willing nor the pro-American statement of the New Europe would probably have come about, only the barking of a lapdog, the poodle, as Blair was widely mocked. Tony Blair, the most European of all previous British prime ministers, is obviously also preparing himself for the fact that America could become the big loser in the new power shifts. At the end of last year, he stated soberly, "Europe is the area in which over 500 million people live, and a political and economic entity larger than the USA and Japan put together. Europe is vital to the UK. 60% of trade is with the EU. 3 million jobs depend on the EU." End quote. From this he concluded, Europe's role in the world is too weak. Schroeder and Chirac applauded. The much-vaunted continental drift between America and Europe puts the British in a difficult position. They still believe they have a mediating role between the opponents and hope to be able to continue dancing at both parties. They are practicing the balancing act between Washington and Berlin until it hurts. By then at the latest, they will have to decide which continent they want to belong to. Moreover, Europe, not America, is seen as a left-liberal projection screen. There is also a debate in the UK as to whether a European power bloc might not be the more civilized and peaceful model. The European project objectively exerts a strong pull on the islands. Blair will have no interest in opposing the idea of better European capitalism. The anti-American sentiment is now manifest in his own clientele. That the war against Iraq is one designed to serve the American interest in national security and containment of aggressive anti-American pan-Arabism is difficult for the British party left to digest. For them, the liberation of Albanian terrorists is just as understandable, because it is empathetic, as Saddam's pan-Arabism, which as a leading figure gave a boost to the battered Arab Islamic self-confidence. This is how it is decided which war one is in favor of and which one suddenly becomes an advocate of peace and international law. Robin Cook, who as British Foreign Secretary at the time had war waged against Yugoslavia, railed on behalf of the party left against the illegal Iraq campaign and warned of international isolation, particularly within Europe, should the British remain on the side of the Americans. On one issue, the Blair government has already decided in favor of the old Europe. While Britain was enforcing UN Resolution 1441 militarily in Iraq, British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw repeatedly reminded the Americans that there were also resolutions that Israel did not comply with and was applauded for this in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. The Americans have announced that they will put the conflict in and around Israel on the agenda after the end of the Iraq War. So far, so sensible. A roadmap is to be presented as a basis for negotiations. But the British are railing against Israel and want to push through the roadmap without discussion, while Israel wants changes on many points. Israel is asking itself whether Blair is an opponent. At least that's how the Daily Yedioth Ahronoth sees it. Now that Blair's soldiers are shedding their blood in Bush's war in Iraq and hundreds of thousands of young Britons are demonstrating on the streets against Blair, the guilt bill is on the table. Blair is pushing Bush because he is being pushed by his comrades in Labour. The roadmap alone is thought to be worth 60 MPs to Blair, who today are wavering between support and opposition to the Iraq War. For them, Israeli policy, and first and foremost the settlement policy, is no less abhorrent than Saddam's policy. End quote. In addition, with their recent anti-Israeli policy, the British have adapted an essential element of the regime they have just crushed in Iraq. In order to regain domestic political peace with his own left-wing clientele, whose intellectual wing has been openly calling for a boycott of any cooperation with Israeli universities or research institutions for over a year, and to send positive signals to the Arab states, Jack Straw is playing the bulldozer against Israel. Blair can be satisfied with his domestic political success. By closing ranks with the modern European anti-capitalism of attack, New Labour necessarily ends up with the Jews. If Britain's social democracy really does go down this road, then the only hope would be for the Conservatives. In 1932, Churchill met with a favourite of the up-and-coming Hitler named Ernst Hafstengel, to whom he asked a completely naive but serious question: "What does your boss have against the Jews? You may condemn the individual if he does something wrong. But how can you condemn someone because of their origins? What can a person do about how he is born?" End quote. He did not receive an answer, but he understood. In the years that followed, as he tirelessly warned against the Nazis, he became a beacon of hope for British Jews and those who had fled to Britain. Today, peace activists are demonstrating in London against the USA and Israel. 1 month after the attacks on New York and Washington, the Financial Times wrote, "Long before the Afghanistan mission, George W. Bush had placed a bronze bust of Churchill in his office. A gesture that has not failed to have an effect." End quote. Whether Bush is fit to inherit Churchill's moral imperative is one question. Blair, however, has already failed as little Churchill if he continues to flirt with a peace camp on his way to Europe, against which he should actually be warned by the words of a friend of peace. Quote, "Circumstances have forced me to talk almost exclusively about peace for decades. Only by continuing to emphasize Germany's desire for peace and its intentions for peace was it possible for me to win freedom for the German people bit by bit and to give them the armament that was always necessary for the next step. It goes without saying that such decades of peace propaganda also have their dubious sides, for it can only too easily lead to the view being established in the minds of many people that the present regime is in itself identical with the determination and the will to preserve peace under all circumstances." End of quote. The name of this pacifist, Adolf Hitler. On June 30th, just under a week after the Brexit referendum, Die Zeit posed the question, "What to do if the wrong party wins?" on its front page, demonstrating an understanding of democracy that merely distrusts bourgeois parliamentarism because in cases of doubt, political opponents also make use of so-called basic democratic rights. She is thus following in the German tradition of undermining these basic rights with morals and noble ideals. Jan Fleischhauer would have liked to declare this unfortunate tradition as outdated in Der Spiegel. The sociologist Werner Sombart came to the conclusion that the English are a nation of hucksters who put money above freedom, whereas idealism has been preserved in the German heroic people. This, too, can now be counted among the certainties that have been dispelled by Brexit. End quote. On the contrary, the Germans have not only retained their idealism in every European crisis, which they now sell as progressive, i.e. anti-national and pro-European in their view. The open resentment against everything and everyone who opposes it is also becoming ever clearer. This is why the otherwise extremely questionable Lorenz Jäger posed the legitimate question in the FAZ as to whether such affects, no longer controlled by any inner moral discipline, have really intensified since Brexit. Since this summer, the answer has to be in the affirmative. There is no getting around the diagnosis that hatred is growing in intensity and shamelessness, sometimes in a more subtle, sometimes in an unsubtle form. And this sheer hatred is by no means a privilege of the radical right. The focus of this summer's popular anger was primarily on old white English people, although their supposedly thoroughly reactionary attitude and blame for the outcome of the Brexit vote quickly turned out to be an interested interpretation that did not take into account the voter turnout of the various age groups. Fueled by the soccer Brexit stern, following the early elimination of the English national team from the European Championships, resentment finally took full flight. British politicians, who according to their own statements, initially simply wanted to spend some time with their families again, had to allow themselves to be described as upper rats by model Germans such as Christoph Waltz, who were leaving the sinking ship with their tails between their legs to retreat to some other profitable business, to name just one example. In view of the reactions in the press, politics and everyday life, a feeling of anti-German nostalgia could almost creep over you, from times when glorifying references to the Royal Air Force Bomber Command and its Commander-in-Chief Sir Arthur Harris were a must at any demonstration. Since the summer, however, the ideological vanguard of anti-British popular anger has not been made up of diehards who rant and rave about the bomb holocaust on the occasion of the much-deserved aerial bombardment of Dresden. Rather, anti-nationals such as the regional branch of the Hamburg Party, which successfully posted a picture of Boris Johnson on Facebook with the caption "Farewell, Britain, keep an inbreeding," linking the alleged incestuously caused degeneration of Johnson's physiognomy to his political attitudes, his character, which were deemed to be wrong. Just as it has become completely normal in the major media to make fun of Johnson's or Trump's mere appearance and the alleged stupidity of their voters. German humorists have learned to sell the cheapest resentments as a plea for a better Germany and the Volksgemeinschaft against the right. Jan Bomerman, whose bumbling poem on Erdogan can only be defended because of the infamy and cowardice of the political reactions that cowered before the permanently offended Islamic man on the Bosporus, also belongs to this type of humorist. Bomerman thus seconded the hatred of old age, which has been omnipresent not only since the debate about Brexit, with a pseudo-witty demand for a referendum against old people and accommodation in old people's homes, until deportation. He later followed this up with a corresponding video in which, according to his own statement, he hits the country's biggest social parasites. This kind of thing only appears to be satire, as it requires a certain artistic refraction that reveals a distance from the object of criticism or creates such a successful mimetic identification with it that it makes the viewer shudder. Bomerman, on the other hand, markets either the simply offensive or the rebelliously conformist in a way that is not necessarily politically correct but compatible and is thus in line with the completely unironic line of many a government politician. The greatest absurdity came from Sigmar Gabriel, who called for dual citizenship for young Britons at the SPD's European Congress. In all seriousness, one should not simply pull up the drawbridge and leave them alone with the snobs of the British elite. Apart from the stale anti-aristocratic metaphor, against the snobs who pulled up the drawbridge to their manor, the proposal seems to fit into a long tradition of global German population policy. Just as in the German Empire, ethnic Germans belonging to other nations were to be expatriated from their own nation-states and repatriated to the Reich by means of dual citizenship, which already existed for them at the time, pro-German Britons are now to be de-anglicized and Germanized, so to speak, via the EU. In 1949, at the beginning of a phase of economic growth and social security in Western industrialized countries that lasted almost 3 decades, the British social scientist Thomas H. Marshall gave a lecture on citizenship and social class in Cambridge. It became famous in this country because the sociologist Ralph Dahrendorf referred to it in his 1957 habilitation thesis, Social Classes and Class Conflict in Industrial Society. Dahrendorf was attracted by the optimism with which Marshall, seemingly unaffected by the devastation caused by migration policy in the previous decades, claimed a continuity of progress from the development of civil rights in the 18th century to the guarantee of political rights in the 19th and the establishment of social rights in the 20th century. Hannah Arendt's reflections on displaced persons, which were passed back and forth between nation-states in the period between the First World War and the Allied victory over National Socialist Germany as irrefutable proof that human rights are only valid as citizens' rights, had no place in Marshall's hymn of praise to citizenship. Rather, his tone was determined by the future phase of Great Britain at the time, unlike today's prosperous welfare state, which Dahrendorf recommended to his fellow countrymen as a model. In contrast, the Berlin modern historian Dieter Goswinkel, who places Marshall's lecture at the beginning of his study on the transformation of citizenship in the 20th and 21st centuries, uses Marshall's biography to show which experiences were suppressed in his theory. After the beginning of the First World War, Marshall, who was a student in Germany, was interned as an enemy alien, and was only connected to the country of which he was a citizen through diplomatic protection. He had thus himself become an example of the possibility of legal exclusion resulting from the difference between citizenship and nationality, the condition of access to citizenship rights. Precisely because he belonged, qua British nationality, to a nation declared an enemy state by Germany, he was denied citizenship rights. The episode with Marshall only takes on its full significance when it is placed in relation to the concept of the enemy alien, the enemy foreigner, the genesis of which Goswinkel outlines in a later chapter. During the First World War, the enemy alien as a category of alien law became a means of excluding members of enemy states involved in the war, in particular prisoner of war soldiers. The treatment of prisoners of war as enemy aliens was practiced by all belligerent states during the First World War. The suspension of citizenship rights to which the Briton Marshall fell victim, on the other hand, was the result of a systematic tightening of the national demarcation policy, originally initiated by Great Britain itself and directed against Germany, which, as Goswinkel shows, had led to an ethnicization of British citizenship law that made it possible to expatriate even civilian citizens on the grounds of suspicion of disloyalty, based on national origin. What appears to be the introduction of a regressive right of descent into progressive British citizenship law was actually a reaction by the British to the folkish principle of dual citizenship in the German Reich. The fact that the citizenship policy of the German Empire allowed people of German descent to retain their German citizenship if they naturalized in another country was interpreted by Great Britain and France as a strategy to undermine French and British citizenship. Britain responded by institutionalizing the reservation of citizenship rights for German nationals, a principle that soon became generalized and contributed to the erosion of the protective function of citizenship rights, thereby nolens volens promoting the German strategy against which it was directed. Although Goswinkel does not say so, his comments on the emergence of the category of the enemy alien shed new light on the relationship between progressive and regressive aspects of citizenship law. The British concern that the German promotion of dual citizenship contributed to the cross-national enforcement of folkish expansionist policies is echoed today in the German attitude of merely countenancing dual citizenship as a mode of institutionalizing cultural and ethnic cliques within nation-states. The seemingly unjust principle of civic disloyalty assumed by descent, on the other hand, appears to be an early and quite rational response to the apocalyptic politics of the German community of fate, which always put civic loyalties before folkish devotion, not unlike the large number of European Muslims who today avowedly place the laws of Islam above the laws of the nation-states of which they are citizens. Goswinkel focuses on citizenship as a principle established in Great Britain and France in the course of the bourgeois Enlightenment, which is universal in its content but has always remained particular in its validity. Goswinkel shows the conflicts that arose when non-European populations also claimed the principle of citizenship for themselves in the decolonization process from 1900 to 1950, which took on different forms in various European states. The attempt to transform imperial subjects into national citizens based on the model of common law in the former colonies of the British Empire, which had its basis in the strengthening of the legal independence of the dominions since the end of the First World War. The separation between citizenship and citizenship rights in France, which had established a disenfranchisement of citizens in the colonies in the 19th century with a category of the French national and colonial citizen without citizenship rights, which continued during decolonization in the distinction between post-colonial indigenate and republican citoyenate. Finally, the dehumanization of the lawless natives into subhumans in Germany from the German Empire to National Socialism. Although he also focuses on developments in the East from the Tsarist Empire to the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France and Germany form the center of Goswinkel's study. The development of citizenship law in the United States plays a key role with regard to Jewish mass migration in the chapter on citizenship rights between democracy and the racial state, between 1918 and 1945, but otherwise receives little attention. From a legal historical perspective, this is consequent, as the United States invoked the constitutional principles of its British mother country, which it saw as abandoned there and thought it could redeem independently of it. Although he is quite fond of the German concept of civil society, reading Goswinkel's book leaves no doubt that, since the 19th century, Germany has proved to be the European country that is particularly hostile to national sovereignty as a guarantor of civic rights by implementing people's and community rights in citizenship law. Great Britain, on the other hand, whose rejection of the European Union is met with cross-camp malice in this country about the eccentrics who always want an extra sausage, appears on the basis of Goswinkel's material to be what it is hated for, as the most progressive country in Europe in terms of citizenship rights. The fact that Germany is likely to act more than ever as the engine of the European Union in the future can only make the legal historian shudder. So it's time for a new rebellion, in which the younger generation once again gets even with the older generation. It is time for an uprising of ideas for the future against the backward-looking ideal, as Matthias Müller von Blumenkron added in the FAZ newspaper, launching an attack on unproductive elements, who have been nourished by the achievements of their parents, who could find secure work in stable corporations if they wanted to. They are the ones who have sinned against their heritage, who have always lived beyond their means by blithely driving up the national debt at the expense of their descendants. and who now live to a not insignificant extent on a pension that their children can only dream of.
End of quote.
It is accusations such as these or the desire to be part of a youth movement articulated on Zeit Online on the occasion of the British vote, an organization of the young against an old bag policy, in which the contradiction between demographic change and the increasingly repressive demands of capitalist reality is articulated. Subjects react to this with a projective fear of decline, which manifests itself in disgust at physical decline as well as concern about a lack of productivity. In addition to hatred of old age, the cult of youth corresponds to an affirmation of death. Old people are a nuisance precisely because they continue to live unproductively, while children are a nuisance because they are already alive without being able to function properly. This is why current pedagogy makes such a strong effort to level out the differences between the age groups and to trim everything down to an eternally productive youth. No stage of life should be experienced more qualitatively, and such youth movement activism always proves to be a reliable legacy of the folkish movement of Lebensreform and Wandervogel in Germany. Contrary to the broad public consensus, the British vote to leave the European Union was not a purely knee-jerk reaction of white old farts to the 2008 financial crisis and the recent refugee crisis in general. It was essentially an articulation of dissatisfaction with the consequences of 40 years of deindustrialization and precarization resulting from social policy cuts and the wave of privatization since the first Thatcher government, especially in the regions of former heavy industry that have been increasingly left behind since the 1970s. In this respect, the crisis of credit-based growth and the austerity policies of the Tory government in recent years are of course not the cause, but the result of the post-Fordist crisis of capital valorization, which the British felt particularly early on. Thatcher took advantage of the traditionally more widespread skepticism in England towards a paternalistic French-German-style welfare state to react particularly eagerly and hastily to a general trend in the development of capital. Thatcher herself used the slogan, "There is no alternative." In doing so, she did not fall prey to the apocalyptic belief in German ideology, but offer her policies to her countrymen as a pragmatic individualistic self-defense against a state that was too strong. After the effects of the recent crises, the UK was also still in a relatively good position and was largely able to benefit economically from the slimmed-down EU membership, standards and free trade in the EU minus the Eurozone, i.e. a kind of privileged partnership, which could possibly be sought again in a similar way after leaving the EU. After the Tories and their Prime Minister John Major were voted out of office in 1997, this development could no longer be reversed, and that was not the aim of New Labour under Tony Blair. His concept of a new social democracy, with its emphasis on personal responsibility and the role of the activating state, itself adapted neoliberal guidelines, which soon inspired his European Party comrade Schroeder to introduce Agenda 2010. Supplemented by a few, largely symbolic improvements to social benefits, the usual demands such as a return to an interventionist economic policy, the renationalization of privatized companies, the expansion of welfare state benefits and the reversal of labor and trade union laws from the Thatcher era were abandoned. At the risk of completely alienating its core electorate, New Labour instead pushed for a communitarian identity policy that was intended to ideologically compensate for the continued material impoverishment. Thus, in the traditional German sense, the focus was not on the particular interests of one's own class, but on the compulsive harmonization of social misfortune through the homeliness of the shoal and community, which is only seemingly at odds with the economic-political activation discourse. This combination corresponds exactly to the bridging concept between the duality of structure in Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, which was the inspiration for the so-called Schroeder-Blair paper of 1999 and which no longer demanded equal participation in social wealth in the sense of the old social democracy, but only equal opportunities, which would ensure the primary task of the state should not row, but steer, not so much control as challenge. The specifically British mixture of economic precarization and an accompanying communitarian identity and minority politics was able to gain ideological dominance, particularly in academia and in politics, well into the Tory camp. On the conservative side, David Cameron in particular stands in this tradition, whose talk of the big society and the role of the commons to be strengthened within it was aimed at further undermining the welfare state. NGOs and social entrepreneurs are to take over key areas of state administration in the education, care and health sectors. In return, Cameron pushed through the legal equality of homosexual partnerships, for example. New Labour also attempted to create a kind of illusory growth with an economic policy focus on financial services and the new economy, and to promote rather unproductive precarious service activities in particular with tax breaks. Public jobs were mainly advertised in regions that had been left behind in the hope of keeping voters in line. This post-Fordist paternalism of British social democracy was joined by that of the EU institutions. Their aim was never to prepare for European unification in the sense of a truly pan-European state, and certainly not to ensure a decisive improvement in the living conditions of its formal citizens. Rather, the responsible bodies assumed that their own policy of handouts and modest transfer payments for structurally weak regions would forever compensate for the unsatisfactory policy of paternalism. The offended and aggressive reactions at the highest EU levels following the Brexit vote are evidence of this. The fact that the few comforts, such as the constantly invoked free movement of persons in the EU, are primarily a matter of capital, which is likely to play a lesser role in the everyday lives of former miners from Nottinghamshire than for freelance hipsters from London or Berlin, should not be an issue. Accordingly, the opponents of the Leave campaign were above all the spasmodically young urban middle class, for whom the flexibilization and precarization of wage labor has become second nature and who misunderstand their eternal project juggling, their efforts to obtain foreign scholarships for a successful CV, and their constant willingness to quickly find their feet in new jobs as a strength of character. The resentment of the Leave agitators was directed against the policies of this clientele, who could be sure of the support of the completely left-behind former proletariat, against multiculturalism, the promotion of minorities, feminism, green politics, globalization, but also against the growing importance of the internet and increased immigration, as a survey by Lord Ashcroft poll shows. The economic declassification and dismantling not only of the old white working class by a left liberal elite, masked by the ostensible goal of inclusion, promoted social segregation and made conditions such as those in Rotherham possible in the first place, to which the autochthonies occasionally react to with outright xenophobia. Brexit was also immediately about limiting Eastern European immigration, which is only understandable against the backdrop of Eastern Europeans threatening to block white, proletarian Britain's professional exit and escape route from their ghettos in Blackburn, Bradford, etc., which became such in the first place not least due to Islamization. Poles in particular began to outstrip the British as craftsmen and nurses as a result of the long-standing liberal immigration policy, making it increasingly difficult to leave deindustrialized northern England for London or southern England, i.e. regions with masses of service jobs. What we need to flee from are the consequences of decades of cultural communitarianism. Roughly speaking, it has resulted in two models. Alongside the precarious gang society of certain London districts and many central and northern English ex-industrial cities, where openly delinquent ghetto Islam dominates, there is an apparent countermodel. This authoritarian, pacified version of Islamic communities, based on the restructuring of the secular state and the subjugation of the non-Islamic remaining population, is emerging in Blackburn, for example, a former center of the textile industry and the town with the highest proportion of Muslim inhabitants in Great Britain. The economic success of some Muslims in the post-industrial social wasteland does not lead to the successful ones turning away from the clan and seeking their own individual advancement. Rather, it leads to the urban dominance of these clans because they form the basis of success. They provide the social resource that the individualized, white precarious worker necessarily lacks, since the proletarian self-administration that was once so strong in England, together with its cooperative organizations, no longer exists. Stephanie Bolzen portrayed this new upper class in the former industrial district in Die Welt. Quote, LBBY Master is representative of a growing section of the British Muslim community, whose influence on the face of this country is only set to grow. Professionally extremely successful, with considerable wealth and a young generation, many of whom attend the best schools and universities. At the same time, these Muslims are extremely conservative. They share their everyday working lives with non-Muslims, but otherwise they generally keep to themselves. They invest a lot of money and engagement in their religious community, which is controlled by their leaders and not by politics or the police.
End quote.
In view of this development, the observer is faced with an alternative. Either one generalizes the concept of racism as a pure ideology of achievement and competition in such a way that it would also have to include the hatred of the digital bohemians and so-called millennials for the old white working class, in which unemployment and poverty are noticeably greater than among the Muslims of Indian origin, and strictly orthodox Sunnis of Blackburn. Alternatively, one would have to admit that although the Brexit vote was partly motivated by xenophobia, racial ideology and skin color did not play a role, but the well-founded fear of the growing influence of a certain religious community did. In that case, however, it would be uncomfortable to realize that, in addition to the envy of immigrants from Eastern Europe, the rejection of further Muslim immigration and the German supremacy in Europe that is pushing it forward may have a rational core. Despite this, the British vote in favor of Brexit became nothing less than an opportunity for ethnic cleansing in Angle World, for example. You really don't have to be particularly sympathetic to the white trash milieu, but it is absolutely vile and devoid of any knowledge of British reality to portray it as particularly racist, incompetent and stupid simply because it looks after its own interests in a way that displeases the left-wing German observer. This view also completely ignores the fact that although there was a racist base among the English industrial proletariat, There was also traditionally more willingness than in any other European country to regard immigrant colleagues from the former colonies as equals among equals, i.e., to give preference to class over race. This is evidenced not least by the adaptation of African American music and Caribbean lifestyles in proletarian subcultures such as skinheads and mods. The anti-British resentment that is currently bursting forth, especially from Germans who consider themselves progressive, must be countered by the fact that skepticism towards European immigration policy formulates justified reservations against members of a religion and not a race. It must also be pointed out that the British, unlike the Germans, are now neither setting fire to refugee homes en masse nor rolling out prayer mats in enthusiastic preemptive submission in the face of migration, and that this absence of delusional outbursts of affect is seen by the Germans as a symptom of coldness. Nevertheless, in order to maintain the impression of the racist British, not only left-wing weekly newspapers warned of ethnic cleansing, but the so-called quality media also claimed a connection that is not so clear. Everywhere there was talk of a sharp rise in racism in the UK, to Gestjaw, and a wave of racism, Handelsblatt, Focus, Stern, that was threatening to spill over onto the island. However, the alleged dramatic worsening of the situation in the UK, particularly in England, was unanimously based on statistical estimates that initially only covered the month of June, with the alleged jump in xenophobic and racist attacks, Spiegel Online, largely being very general and arbitrarily interpreted hate crimes. Although these also include actual physical assaults or the death threat against an African cultural center, none of the alarmist reports provided any information on the extent to which these crimes increased over the same period, how they relate to the Brexit vote, and whether the attribution racist is more the result of the observer's arbitrariness than an accurate characterization of the perpetrators and acts. The incidents mentioned were mainly threats against the Polish minority mentioned, but also incidents such as a dog excrement attack against Germans, picture, and swastika smearings on their cars. Reports such as these, or the fact that Germans allegedly reported racism in tears, as RP Online put it, completely exposed the concerned German warnings to ridicule and showed how much the Germans were primarily concerned with themselves and their sensitivities. It is therefore only consequent that the warnings about British racism generally referred unnamed to the increased registration of perceived discrimination in the course of the #PostRefRacism campaign, as well as to a 2014 study from The Guardian. However, this study found, among other things, a higher bias in prejudice among manual and industrial workers, but also refers to the increased acceptance of same-sex marriage and premarital sex. Unfortunately, there is no information on the corresponding attitudes among members of the allegedly persecuted minorities. However, The Guardian did give an indication of at least one of them elsewhere in April of this year. According to a study, 52% of British Muslims are against the legality of homosexuality, while 23% want to introduce Sharia law. So if the referendum had led to mass assaults and if the desire of many Britons to leave the EU was based solely on their racism and xenophobia, we can assume that Theresa May, who is concerned about her country's reputation, would have taken a stand on this in her inaugural speech as Prime Minister on July 13. Instead, even the British Prime Minister addressed the actual structural connection that affects almost all social groups, even if it may appear as group-related misanthropy in selective
perception.
Quote, "If you are born poor, you will die an average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system than if you are white. If you're a white, working-class boy, you're less likely than anyone else in Britain to go to university. If you are a woman, you will earn less than a man. If you suffer from mental health problems, there's not enough help to hand. If you're young, you'll find it harder than ever before to own your own home."
End quote.
From a European perspective, the British have acted more instrumentally and rationally than the Germans can even think about. For the British criticism of the EU clearly recognizes the differences between the international hegemony of the USA after the Second World War and the German hegemony in Europe after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. In no European crisis did it occur to the envious, short-sighted hegemon Germany, like the USA after the Second World War, to grant the weakening states a whole series of special rights such as cheap loans or trade facilitation in order to be recognized as a hegemon for decades. The Americans thus did something that was costly for them in the short term, but from which they benefited in the long term, and so did the rest of the world, as Hans Kuhn Nani noted in Die Zeit. Something unthinkable in German politics, and not only due to the different historical constellation, which frightened such a change in the culture of stability, Marcus Soder, and which, from a European perspective, is guided by nothing other than the Germans' inability, turned to economics, for Republican, bourgeois national self-love, as was already stated in the course of the refugee crisis. In the UK, on the other hand, something of the political pragmatism of classic hegemonic politics has been preserved, which enables judgments such as Kuhn Nani's and which the German sociologist and Nazi inspirer Werner Sombart had already condemned as mechanistic, materialistic and individualistic, or as the intellectual narrowness and inability to rise even a hand's breadth above the tangible and everyday reality. In Germany, paradoxically, the alienated thinking of the Anglo-Saxons has since been regarded precisely as pragmatism, the conscious organization of a super-individual, which puts the idea of the organic independent life of each state in place of the grocer's idea of a dead equilibrium between the individual states. As long as the current situation in Europe has the advantages of low unit labor costs, relatively low unemployment and high export rates for the production community of the Germans, all seems well with the world, and a state in crisis can be treated like an insolvent company due to the peculiar construction of the EU, without having to be jointly liable for its debts. But it is precisely this shared responsibility, which was thought to have been disposed of, that is now being brought back into play by the South as a desire for reform during the exit of the economically still relatively independent UK from the European Union. And Germany is brazenly pushing for Brexit to be completed as quickly as possible, so that this demand cannot gain any ground and nothing changes in the structure that is so advantageous for German exports. Since the complete internationalization of capital, it is undoubtedly impossible to retreat to the traditional nation-state. Closed state sovereignty is generally similar to the ideal of ego strength on the part of the subject, in reality fragmented and inadequate to the flexibilized conditions of a totally mobilized society, even anachronistic in the literal sense. Nevertheless, wanting to regain some of that sovereignty often tends towards delusion in view of the almost insoluble task of allowing neither the power of others nor one's own impotence to make one stupid, according to Adorno, but can also be an expression of a remnant of bourgeois rationality and in this sense necessary. In this sense, the British exit also testifies to that Republican Anglo-Saxon self-confidence that has always been repugnant to German European ideologues and appeared to be an expression of anti-German, alien powers. And today, the Germans once again perceive the British project as an unparalleled particularist nationalist affront, as the German idea of Europe is based precisely on the ideology of renouncing sovereignty and the apparent juridification of international relations of force, against the backdrop of which Germany has learned to cloak its own hegemonic power politics as an anti-national lesson from Auschwitz. In a kind of hysterical sovereignty envy, people therefore look to the stubborn British, whose vote also symbolically shakes the ideal of German Europe. This model results from the afterlife of National Socialism in democracy, Adorno. The plans of the then Reich Minister of Economics and Reichsbank President Walther Funk for the economic reorganization of Europe already anticipated many things. The Reichsmark as the reserve currency, a European central bank, reduction of customs duties, internal equalization of European balances of payments, etc. The Nazis were in the tradition of the Nazis. The Nazis were in the tradition of German ideas about Europe from the interwar period, and their statements can hardly be distinguished from those of an EU bureaucrat. There is no need for lengthy proof to show that European solidarity will entail certain sacrifices on the part of the participating states, but at the same time will lead to an undreamt of blossoming of the economic, cultural and social life of our continent, as Joseph Goebbels, not Martin Schulz or Jean-Claude Juncker, put it. This was always based on the desire for a core or central European unification for the purpose of a German-dominated Greater Europe to the exclusion of Bolshevik Russia and Great Britain, as had previously been cherished by German social democrats or national liberals such as the FDP godfather Friedrich Naumann. This Europe was to be realized on the basis of the commonalities of its natural constitution, as a community of destiny, as opposed to national egoism, and to be organized on the basis of a division of labor between Europe's industrial heart and its agrarian peripheries. Even Nigel Farage knows more about the implicit threat contained therein and its consequences, which were later explicitly stated and then put into practice, than the entire German political caste. His universally scandalized statement that Brexit was successfully achieved, without a single bullet being fired, should be understood against this backdrop. Remembering that the liberation from attempts at European unification, as pursued by Germany, has already been achieved twice by war. The old British-German antagonism therefore unsurprisingly did not just break out yesterday. When Margaret Thatcher warned against German ideas of a European Grossraum in the early 1990s, Wolfgang Schäuble, then chairman of the CDU/CSU parliamentary group in the Bundestag and now finance minister, published a position paper on the European unification process with his colleague Karl Lamers in 1994, which confirmed Thatcher's fears in its warning against an elevated free trade area of British provenance and its plea for a two-speed core Europe, promoted by Germany. Left-wingers often fail to recognize that this paper, which is usually accused of classic nationalist great power aspirations, laid the essential foundations of new German ideology, namely the legitimization of Germany's new role in world politics through the proclaimed renunciation of sovereignty, the rejection of national hegemonic policies as a lesson from history in the warning against a return to the national and the nation-state, indeed a regressive nationalism. Wolfgang Schäuble's recent reflections on the threat of Brexit, in which he sought to update his core European approach in order to make it clear that the proclaimed anti-nationalism can also be an expression of hard-nosed power politics. In case of doubt, the intergovernmental must come to the fore. And further, we have shown the way with the Euro rescue system. The principle can be extended to other areas if necessary, to the Europeanization of armaments budgets and the management of the refugee crisis.
End of quote.
So, Germany pulls one or two weighty nations onto its side, with which it then imposes its line on the rest. Just as it did during the financial crisis and the subsequent state crises in southern Europe, and as it recently tried to do with Eastern Europe and the UK in the so-called refugee crisis. The fact that the UK has now, to Schäuble's complete surprise, withdrawn from this attempt at blackmail brings tears to the finance minister's eyes. When I was asked in London what I would do if Brexit were to happen, I said I would cry, he confessed to Die Welt. This is in no way contradicted by the fact that last year he formulated a possible Greek exit from the Eurozone as a blatant threat. After all, Schäuble's ideas can no more be categorized as classic conservative ideas than those of his intellectual predecessors Sombart and his ilk. Examples of this are Schäuble's statements in Die Zeit on June 9, when he wished for a revolution, as he once did as Interior Minister, formulated criticism of America and the rich, called for a new policy for Africa to ward off economic migrants and a welcome for Muslims, whose generous reception he justified as follows: isolation is what would destroy us, what would cause us to degenerate into inbreeding. For us, Muslims in Germany are an enrichment of our openness and our diversity. Just take a look at the third generation of Turks, especially the women. They have enormous innovative potential.
End of quote.
In other words, immigration is not based on purely utilitarian considerations or even a simple willingness to help, but as an innovative rejuvenation of the German national body. How faithful the Germans have remained to themselves in the person of Schäuble may be difficult to understand for people who continue to misunderstand National Socialism as an exaggerated nationalism of Prussian provenance and a somewhat more extreme form of Italian fascism, and the policies of the post-Nazi FRG as an almost unbroken continuation of the same. The core element of National Socialist ideology, however, was an anti-nationalist state doctrine, which was intended to bring about the softening of rigidities and incrustations in the war, which is the prerequisite for the formation of new national political communities, as Joseph Goebbels put it in his speeches on Europe in 1942. In other words, precisely the overcoming of artificial borders, the abolition of every bourgeois, and of course also German nation-state for the benefit of a higher ideal, the supranational idea of the German Volksgemeinschaft. The Germans always hated national state affiliation by chance of birth or political will in combination with free self-determination of the individual, as advocated by liberal state theory. The British in particular, with their anti-European aspirations, were already considered by Goebbels to represent this theory. And to this day, such resentments continue to cloud the consciousness of supposed critics who, with the essentially always anti-Zionist slogan "No border, no nation" and the demand for the immediate abolition of all borders, abuse those who have fled to Europe as the supposed avant-garde of a post-national order. Despite all the understandable reasons for the Brexit vote, there is still something unpleasant about the British decision, even if one disregards its politically questionable propagandists. Namely, the glorification of the self-determination of the people, the proverbial thought piece for the political elites far removed from the people. Such longing for plebiscitary immediacy contradicts the high degree of institutional rationalization of politics that Marx and Engels, for example, appreciated in the modern representative state. The national egoism, ostracized by the British vote, as already rejected by the Nazis, on the other hand, is part of its historical substance. But neither Wolfgang Schäuble nor the German Antifa want to know anything about it. In order to pacify the Eurosceptic wing of his party and bring them to their senses, the British Prime Minister decided to take an unusual step. He announced that he would renegotiate Britain's membership of the European market and present the result to the population in a non-binding, consultative referendum, the outcome of which would be accepted without any ifs or buts. Even if the renegotiations did not deliver the desired result, Harold Wilson's plan worked, not least thanks to the support of the Conservative Party under opposition leader Margaret Thatcher. On June 5, 1975, the question of whether the United Kingdom should remain in the European Community and Common Market, which it had joined 2.5 years earlier under the Conservative Edward Heath, was answered with yes by over 17.3 million, a good 67% of Britons. The result strengthened the centrist wing around Prime Minister Wilson and his later successor Callaghan within the ruling Labour Party and was a slap in the face for the left-wing opponents of the EU around Michael Foot, Tony Benn, and Peter Shore. This was not least because support for remaining in the Labour heartland, England and Wales, was particularly high. The No campaign only came close to a majority in Northern Ireland, by far the smallest part of the UK, and only 2 constituencies in the Scottish Islands voted to leave. The Yes campaign, which was supported by almost the entire press, was able to score points with its economic arguments, particularly among English industrial workers who were hoping for growing prosperity. However, the broad-based campaign against alleged Marxist opponents of the free market, the West and progress, was also successful. For example, Industry Minister Tony Benn, who warned of job losses and rising food prices, was denounced and ridiculed as an alarmist, so that despite the support of a narrow majority of Labour MPs against their own government, the No campaign ultimately lacked popular political leadership and the British followed Wilson, Callaghan and Thatcher. David Cameron will certainly go down in history as a significant Prime Minister like Harold Wilson, but in a slightly different way. Under pressure from opposition within his own party and some electoral successes by the anti-EU UK Independence Party, UKIP, following the conclusion of the Lisbon Treaty, he decided to follow in the footsteps of his successful predecessor by renegotiating with the EU and putting the question of whether the UK should remain a member of the EU to the electorate in a non-binding, advisory referendum to be accepted by all. Like Wilson, Cameron could be relatively confident at the time of his decision that he could count on the support of the Labour opposition under Ed Miliband, a staunch supporter of the pro-European Labour Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, whom he had served as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State and Minister in his campaign for a conditional remain against a number of his party colleagues, particularly the Eurosceptic European Research Group, ERG. Despite these parallels with the 1975 referendum, Cameron had underestimated a number of factors that would lead to his dramatic failure. These included the EU's unwillingness to reform, which meant he returned empty-handed, but not least the resentment among large sections of the population at decades of disruption, ranging from Thatcher's deregulation and disempowerment of the trade unions to New Labour's privatizations in the education and health sectors and the austerity policies intensified under Cameron. The youngest Prime Minister in British history, who only came to office through a coalition government, which is rare in British majority voting law, was also only able to shed the image of the hard-working striver from a good home who does not understand the electorate to a limited extent and, unlike Wilson, was unable to bring the weight of a widely respected Prime Minister to bear. Furthermore, 2 fundamentally different people entered the political stage in 2015 who were instrumental in the failure of the referendum: Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. While the former, as a popular former mayor of London beyond conservative circles, became the driving force behind the official Leave campaign, the latter, as a proven exponent of the left wing of the party, opponent of Tony Blair and New Labour, political foster son of Tony Benn and well-known Eurosceptic, had little to oppose the unofficial campaign in Northern England and Wales, which was primarily supported by UKIP. Corbyn refrained from vehemently backing the official party position in favour of the UK remaining in the EU and expressed his disinterest in the whole campaign by going on vacation during the hot phase of the election campaign. Before becoming leader of the opposition and party leader in 2015 through a coalition of the old and new left, he had repeatedly positioned himself against the European market, the free movement of goods, capital, services and people, and the accompanying undermining of social democratic reforms, workers' rights and capital taxation. In 2009, during the rerun of the Irish referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which failed at the first attempt, he supported the EU opponents and said in a speech that the activists should pick up their placards, as they would certainly be sent to the polls a third time if they won again. The vote on Britain's exit from the EU therefore took place under the paradoxical sign that both the governing party and the main opposition party were predominantly at odds with their leadership. The increasingly Eurosceptic Conservative Party base did not follow Prime Minister Cameron and Chancellor of the Exchequer Osborne, who were vehemently in favour of remaining, while opposition leader Corbyn had to put aside his scepticism towards the EU out of consideration for a very largely pro-European Labour Party. Accordingly, the election campaign did not follow traditional party lines, but rather political issues relating to economic consequences, immigration, fiscal policy, EU contributions and regulations, sovereignty, security, etc. The opposing camps can be most accurately divided into anywheres and somewheres, i.e. citizens who are necessarily attached to their region and those who have severed these roots. Those in favour of the EU had their strongholds in London, Oxbridge and Scotland, and were supported by large companies and their employees, university and other education staff, political office holders and employees in the state, creative and media sectors. Opponents of the EU were most popular in the rest of England and Wales, in the rural conservative south as well as in the former industrial centres in the north, among workers and employees on low wages, pensioners, small business owners and the self-employed. In contrast to all previous general elections since 1983, The Brexit referendum thus offered a clear choice between the agenda of the left behind somewheres and the ideas of the success accustomed anywheres, which contributed to the enormous politicization and the highest voter turnout since 1992. According to Goodhart, 4 central concerns can be identified that contributed to the success of the Brexit campaign. Firstly, the erosion of the middle class and the milieu of traditional industrial workers. Secondly, the expansion of universities and the increase in the proportion of the population with a university education under the slogan knowledge economy, in favor of the children of wealthy and educated parents at the expense of training in technical, skilled trades, and other professions for secondary school leavers. Thirdly, mass immigration and the associated replacement of missing unskilled and skilled workers with immigrants, which has led to an acceleration of social change and massive pressure on the wages of ordinary workers and employees. And fourthly, the decline of traditional families and local communities. What they have in common is the overarching question of national sovereignty, of social balance within the framework of the nation-state, in contrast to the anti-national EU, which is not inaccurately understood as the epitome of the institutionalization of the hegemony of the anywheres. The constantly repeated slogan of the official Leave campaign was logically and not only directed against Brussels, but also against the British political and status class: take back control. The idea that a European authority on the other side of the Channel could have a decisive say in the internal affairs of the United Kingdom was not as unpopular in any part of the country as it was in England, the core of the United Kingdom. While Scotland, with a large majority and in all 32 constituencies, and Northern Ireland, with a clear majority of over 55%, voted to remain in the EU, the situation in England was completely different. Of the 9 English regions, only Greater London voted to remain with 60%, while the remaining 8 regions from southwest to northeast England and Wales voted by a majority to leave. Voter turnout, which was reported in Germany primarily in terms of age distribution, was also significantly higher in England and Wales than in Scotland and Northern Ireland. The 17.41 million votes for Brexit are the largest number of Britons ever to vote for a political decision, just ahead of the 17.38 million who voted to join the EC in 1975. To this day, the shock that this result caused among the politically hegemonic anywheres in the media, politics and universities has not been digested, and 2 governments fell over it, that of David Cameron and that of his hapless successor Theresa May. The unwillingness to take note of the result, let alone acknowledge it, which has its deeper cause not least in the social composition of the Remain camp, expresses the class character of the vote particularly clearly. Many people are unlikely to know anyone who voted Leave and openly admitted it. Critics of the cultural division into anywheres and somewheres and the classification of populist voters as globalization losers have certainly noticed that class affiliation and the position of a region were central to the result. Although Brexit was also a vote against a class perceived as a political elite, motives that are most reminiscent of the Yellow Vest movement predominated. At the forefront was the desire for a return to national state reform policies in favor of abandoned and forgotten regions that are aging, have poor infrastructure, and where the deindustrialization of the Thatcher and New Labour years and Islamization have left a trail of devastation. Ignoring this fact, the Conservative Party establishment prevented a prominent supporter of Brexit such as Boris Johnson from taking the helm after David Cameron, instead electing Home Secretary Theresa May as leader, a politician who was in favor of Britain remaining in the EU and wanted to maintain David Cameron's economic policy course. Her first serious mistake was to call an early general election immediately after the request to leave the EU in order to increase her majority for the Brexit negotiations with the EU. Contrary to what the polls and the low popularity of her opponent Corbyn suggested, however, the decision backfired. Assuming that Brexit would now be implemented, the Labour Party made surprising gains and the right-wing UKIP imploded. Many supporters and sympathizers of the Democratic left clearly saw the result of the Brexit referendum and the disempowerment of the new Labour camp within the party as 2 events that made it possible for them to opt for the domestic policy line of the Labour Party, which had swung to the left and promised social democratic reform policies for the benefit of broad sections of the population. Theresa May's liberal conservative policies, which primarily announced the continuation of austerity policies, tax cuts and less government, were dealt a considerable blow in the 2017 election. UKIP failed to win a single seat, the Conservatives lost 13 seats and Labour gained 30 seats. In addition, the Scottish Nationalists lost over a third of their seats, as the failed independence referendum in 2014 and the impending Brexit meant that the idea of Scottish independence, which would only be possible relatively risk-free if both countries were members of the EU, was off the table for the time being. After all parties promised to implement Brexit, which at least gave the somewheres and deplorables the feeling that their votes carried weight, the populist and moderate right and the Scottish separatists suffered heavy defeats. Consequently, it seems reasonable to conclude that the referendum was not an example of the unstoppable rise of right-wing populism, but rather an example of how it can be stopped. It was only the inability or unwillingness of the newly elected Parliament and May's government to actually decide on the promised Brexit, and the Labour Party's change of course, which now advocated a second referendum between remaining in the EU completely or to a large extent, that led to the meteoric rise of the newly founded Brexit Party of longtime UKIP leader Nigel Farage in the 2019 European elections, while Labour and the Tories were deprived of almost all support by voters. So it was not the Brexit deal, but its non-implementation that played into the hands of those who mobilized against the political establishment at every opportunity and with quite conspiracy-theoretical overtones, because the political class and the pro-government sector supporting it were behaving exactly as the far-right had always claimed. Now, with hard evidence that not just sovereignty but the very core of UK democracy was in a bad way, voters who had voted Leave in 2016 and Labour or Tories in 2017 flocked to the Brexit Party, which became the strongest party in all 8 of the 9 English regions that voted to leave. The change in the British population's assessment of the EU between 1975 and today points to deeper changes in British society, which are also reflected in eroding party loyalty. Since the Brexit vote was not least a reaction to the political neglect of the losers of globalization, the question arises as to the role of the British left, who were the most vehement critics of closer ties to the EU from the 1960s to the 1980s. There was a decisive difference in the development of bourgeois society between Great Britain and France, the 2 oldest democracies in Europe, while universal, equal and free suffrage was introduced in France, but the constitution safeguarded property rights and thus the capitalist order. Legislation in Great Britain was less strongly tied to an unchangeable constitutional core, which is why proletarians were denied free, universal and equal suffrage until 1918 in order to safeguard power relations. While the class struggle in France was revolutionary, in Great Britain it was reformist to radical democratic. The British workers' and trade union movement and the Labour Party were accordingly confident, along with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that parliamentary majorities would pave the way to socialism, for which it was only necessary to bring the working class to the ballot box on an equal footing. The closest it came to achieving this was in 1945, when it won a landslide victory after the end of the Second World War under Clement Richard Attlee, who had led the party into the wartime coalition under Churchill, and was able to form the first Labour majority government in British history. Almost more significant than the political turnaround was the associated recognition of the achievements and sacrifices of British working people in 2 world wars, during which they remained loyal to the British state, parliamentarianism and the reform-oriented Labour Party, and thus to the West. It was the only party in Europe to remain largely impervious to fascism and party communism, which to this day feeds a pronounced patriotism as well as the remnants of loyalty to the former Labour Party. After the Second World War, the country was almost bankrupt, with a lack of housing, food and resources for the resumption of economic production. The Attlee government responded by expanding the welfare system and intervening in property rights, which led to the nationalization of central public utilities and industries at the end of the government's term. Alongside urban planning, house building and the establishment of universal social insurance, the establishment of the tax-funded healthcare system through the founding of the National Health Service, NHS, is considered a key socio-political achievement that remains the subject of political debate to this day, even in the run-up to the general election in December 2019. Despite the wave of privatization under Thatcher, the intensified establishment of public-private partnerships under Blair and the austerity policy under Cameron, the British healthcare system continues to enjoy a high reputation among citizens as a tax-funded system. In 2018, 70 years after its introduction, the NHS achieved by far the best result in a survey, with 54% saying Britons were particularly proud of it in their country, well ahead of history, 38%, the Army, 34%, and the royal family, 28%. Against the background of the social policy successes under Attlee, it is not surprising that the Labour left wanted to continue precisely this path of social reform and, not least for this reason, was always opposed to British membership of the European Economic Community. In doing so, however, it overlooked a crucial problem that was already inherent in nationalisation and could be harnessed by later governments in the global crisis of the 1970s for the opposite agenda. The wave of centralized nationalization and the gradual abandonment of local institutions and associations based in the working class and its organizations went hand in hand with increasing centralization in the 1960s and 70s and prepared the destruction of the British welfare state by undermining the potential for resistance. The feudal struggles in the Thatcher years also led to the EU being perceived for the first time not just as being in the interests of large corporations, but as the antithesis of the dismantling of the British welfare state. The idea of a European capitalism, a European social model as a supposedly more humane counterpart to American neoliberalism, propagated in the 1980s and early 1990s under Commission President Jacques Delors, appeared attractive to British trade unions and social democrats, who were never able to recover from the devastating election defeat under the leftist Michael Foot against Thatcher in 1983. After Foot's election as leader, the right wing of Labour split and formed an electoral alliance with the Liberals as a social democratic party. While Thatcher, unpopular after her first election in 1979 due to the onset of social austerity, initially feared for her re-election, the split in the Labour Party and the Falklands War turned the tide completely. The adaptation of a left-wing election manifesto entitled The New Hope for Britain, which was derided by critics as the longest suicide note in history, put an end to her election chances. It propagated unilateral nuclear disarmament, demilitarization, withdrawal from the EEC, the abolition of the House of Lords, taxation of the rich, and the renationalization of recently privatized companies such as British Telecom. With this mixture of sensible social policy demands, nationalization, and anti-imperialist left-wing nonsense, Labour achieved its worst result since the introduction of universal suffrage. Under Foot's successor Neil Kinnock, Labour abandoned its left-wing, anti-Western and anti-European stance, but this only led to moderate gains in votes in 1987. This time it was mainly due to the demobilization and demoralization of the left wing and the bitterly striking miners, with whose best-known leader Arthur Scargill he shares an intimate enmity that lasts to this day. Kinnock's rise and the ditching of the left wing heralded a change of course towards the Third Way, which was to help New Labour to a landslide victory and a return to power in 1997, albeit at the cost of abandoning socialist reform policies. Under Tony Blair, the party succeeded in retaining the dwindling industrial workforce as its voter base, while at the same time penetrating deep into the middle and upper classes and winning over public sector employees in particular. As well as rejecting equality and nationalization in favor of social justice and public-private partnership, New Labour also embraced the idea of free, globalized markets as the best means of achieving universal prosperity, including advocacy of migration, multiculturalism, and British membership of the EU. The failure of this course, which became evident not least as a result of the 2008 crisis, was the basis for the subsequent rise of Jeremy Corbyn and the break with this policy, which is, however, less clear-cut than many on the British left would like to believe. It is impossible to understand the success of the Brexit vote without at least a brief look at the massive destruction to which British society has been subjected since EU membership. Within just one generation, what had dominated social life in large parts of England and Wales was unravelled, gathered around industrial work and working-class associations, and certainly accompanied by ideas of a good, orderly life in the local community, church, sports club, pub, and not least in the family and fatherland. Even if these affiliations were always rightly seen as restrictive and not particularly conducive to individual freedom, as evidenced not least by the contributions of working-class children to British pop culture, their destruction at a pace unprecedented in Europe did not lead to liberation, but only to liberation and atomization. The subordination of a supposedly non-existent society to the demands of global competition has exacerbated and accelerated the tendency towards isolation inherent in capitalism and civilization. Isolation and detachment from social contexts do not liberate the individual, who can only exist in relation to others, but make it even more difficult for him or her to emerge, develop, and evolve. It is precisely this accelerating tendency that promotes the most primitive tribalism, as expressed in identity politic substitutes that sort people again according to gender, skin color, or sexual orientation, whose specific combination simulates individuality. At the same time, however, this regression is claimed to be the progressive replacement for supposedly backward local communities and reactionary nations. For after the deindustrialization under Thatcher came the expansion of immigration, multiculturalism, diversity, and anti-racism under New Labour, which would have been a huge challenge even for cities and communities that were still functioning. The easing of workloads for increasingly untrained craftsmen or nurses from Eastern European countries with their real socialist training system increased frustration through wage pressure, but was nowhere near as fatal as the emergence of parallel Islamic structures, which grew in importance as the original English society became more and more disintegrated. The census carried out every 10 years revealed that between 2001 and 2011 alone, the number of people in England and Wales born outside Europe had increased by almost 3 million, which was reflected not least in the fact that white Britons in London were now only a minority of just over 40%. The proportion of Christians fell by over 4 million from 72 to 59%, while the number of Muslims increased from 1.5 to at least 2.7 million. The speed at which the population structure changed in the wake of New Labour's immigration policy was in no way inferior to the destruction of industrial and trade union structures under Thatcher. The strength of the contrast between disintegrating British structures and closed counter-societies, particularly in the north of England, is demonstrated not least by the so-called grooming gangs. In over 70 towns and cities, neglected British girls from the lower classes were lured with alcohol, food and drugs in order to feed them into an organized local ring of Pakistani men who raped them in turn. In the Labour stronghold of Rotherham, over 1,400 British girls were victims of these gangs between 1997 and 2013, despite the fact that the activities were known to local authorities and the police. Such events would be unthinkable in a society in which remnants of local communities still exist, in which state institutions still function and work for the citizens. Even though the events generated a great deal of media attention, there was no adequate response, not least due to the priorities of law enforcement, which does not take vigorous action against Islamists, but rather against hate speech and opponents of Islamization, whose accounts are arbitrarily blocked, whose homes are searched on flimsy pretexts, whose right to demonstrate is revoked, and against whom every effort is made to put them under lock and key. When it comes to jihadists, on the other hand, people in the UK are much more lenient, look the other way or gloss over the problems. The British state, represented by its civil servants and administration, which detained and questioned 3,300 people for offensive comments on the internet in 2016 alone, does not lack the necessary resources, but rather uses them specifically to advance the fight against understandable reactions to rape, hatred and terror, i.e. against Islamophobic and racist hate speech. The monitoring and reprimanding of unwelcome expressions of opinion that could disrupt cooperation in the beautifully diverse world of work corresponds to a trend that has hardly been taken as far in any other country as in the UK. In place of a binding social framework in which citizens could make their own decisions, even to their detriment, came the nanny state, a term that can only be inadequately translated as a paternalistic state. In order to break the bad habits of the irresponsible lower classes in particular, New Labour introduced some of the strictest laws in Europe, such as the smoking ban and taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthy food. These regulations serve both the authoritarian desires of bureaucrats and the need of capital for healthy human material, but are also the immediate consequence of a politically accelerated decay of sociality, which increasingly produces only subjects in need of care. Emblematic of the state of British society were the reactions to an event that took place just under a year after the Brexit referendum, on the 4th anniversary of Lee Rigby's murder. As the crowd, including many girls and young women, were leaving Manchester Arena after a concert by Ariana Grande, Salman Abedi detonated his homemade nail bomb, killing himself and 22 people and injuring 139 others, some of them seriously. Neither the memory of the victims nor the anger at the perpetrator or the failings of the security authorities determined the media's reception. Instead, a group of people who spontaneously sang the Oasis hit "Don't Look Back" in anger after a minute's silence in memory of the victims became a symbol of the alleged resilience of the people of Manchester. Lydia Bernsmeyer-Rullo, the 32-year-old woman who sang the song, summed up why the video was so enthusiastically received. "Don't look back in anger, that's what it's about. We can't look back at what happened, we have to look to the future. We all came together and we're going to keep going because that's what Manchester is all about," she told The Guardian. This was aimed at anywheres on social media, who shared the video particularly eagerly because the message, which had nothing to do with Manchester and a specific, devastating terrorist attack, resonated with them. The irreverence of singing a song about Sally, a past love that should not be looked back on in anger, and elevating it to a symbol in the face of 22 deaths, shortly after Kelly Brewster was pierced and killed by the nails of a bomb, should have been striking. The 32-year-old from Sheffield had been at the Ariana Grande concert with her sister Claire and 11-year-old niece Holly. In the crowd leaving the concert, Claire was separated from the other two. When the bomb exploded, Kelly instinctively protected her niece, who survived the attack. "Don't look back in anger" became a symbol precisely because the message is doubly perfidious. Firstly, justified anger about a cruel attack on predominantly women and girls should not be expressed under any circumstances, in line with the already largely internalized laws against hate speech, which is why negative emotions must be denied. Even more fatal, however, is the affirmed lack of time and history that has long since become the norm far beyond a terrorist attack, which explains not least the quality of Brexit reporting in the German media, whose exponents are convinced that they live in the timeless present of the great European idea. In particular, the anywheres who no longer view the world from a place, but from a nowhere, necessarily also turn out to be anytimes, who see the future as an endless continuation of the present and the past as obsolete ballast. This points to the bleak lack of history and utopia among young people, not only in the climate movement, but also among those who march through London with European flags in protest against Brexit and brand the Union Jack, of all things, as racist. That a referendum and its result could mean more than possible negative consequences for the exploitation of capital in a country where battles for democratic representation have been waged for centuries, where the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo massacre was only recently commemorated at length, remains just as incomprehensible to anywheres as their fellow citizens' fear of grooming gangs and increasing jihadist terror. This requires the ability to still have a relationship to time and place, like Roy Larner, who was enjoying a quiet evening with 4 or 5 beers outside a pub in London's Borough Market on June 3, 2017, when he was suddenly confronted by 3 terrorists with knives shouting something about Allah and Islam. Shouting, "Fuck you, I'm Millwall," Larner stood in the way of the terrorists and tried to fight them off with his bare hands to allow others to escape, sustaining serious knife wounds to both hands, his chest and head. Although an unemployed 47-year-old with no home, living on a buddy sofa, and a fan of the chronically unsuccessful second division club FC Millwall from South London, whose fans are notorious, they are credited with inventing the chant "Nobody likes us, we don't care," was worth a short heroic story to the media. But because he himself was guilty of a racial slur and damage to property after the attack, Deplorable, who still suffers from the consequences of the attack today, was denied financial compensation for victims of violent crime. The suspicion that government employees who make such decisions to the detriment of those in need could be supporters of the Labour Party and opponents of Brexit is not far-fetched. For despite all the proclamations that Labour is returning to its roots as a working-class party, it has never been further away from this than it is today. Since Thatcher's time, not only has voter turnout among workers and the poorest sections of the British population fallen steadily, but so has their share of Labour officeholders. The coalition that brought Corbyn to power is essentially made up of 3 pillars that identify Corbyn Labour as an heir to, rather than a break with, New Labour: public sector employees that Blair had won to Labour, frustrated upper-middle-class millennials with university educations promoted by Blair, and ethnic minorities that have grown significantly larger under Blair. That this coalition chose as its leader an experienced but hitherto politically marginalised backbencher from the remnant of the old left wing in the tradition of Michael Foot and Tony Benn is entirely consequent. After all, Corbyn shares a superficial dislike of Tony Blair and New Labour as well as anti-Western and therefore anti-British resentment with the young, progressive activists from the diversity left, such as those gathered in the Momentum movement. The fact that his supporter Tony Benn was a powerful and important politician, and not a backbencher in his best years, who fought for social democratic reforms and workers' rights in various offices and functions, was at least overshadowed by his last years as an icon of the anti-imperialist and pacifist left and his appearances against British, American, and Israeli wars. The emphasis on the contradiction between the traditional, anti-European, and the progressive, pro-European momentum left fails to recognize the fundamental change in the role of the European community in the anti-Western worldview after the end of the Soviet Union. The former anti-European Corbyn, just like the late Benn, always railed against NATO and the alliance with the USA in the same breath. They were therefore opponents of the EU for the same reason that most Eastern European states, conversely, absolutely wanted to join the EU and remain there despite all the criticism. But here too, the constellation is likely to have shifted further, not least due to the Iraq War supported by Tony Blair and the new Europe around Germany and France, but not by the old Europe, which is why British left-wing academics educated after 2003 in particular see the 2012 Nobel Peace Prize winner as a counterweight to American and British militarism and neoliberalism. As funny as it may be to see a visibly unwilling old left anti-imperialist appear at a Pink News event and hear him introduce himself by saying that his name is Jeremy Corbyn and his pronouns are he and him, the coalition of traditional and new leftists under the banner of anti-colonialism and anti-racism is consequent. Starting from places like Cambridge University of all places, once the center of intellectual abolitionism, a falsification of history has taken hold among left-wing academics that wants to see the British Empire defined above all by colonialism and slavery. In this respect, even the display of the English or British flag is seen as latently racist and the British heritage as similarly tainted as that of Germany, at a time when demonstrators in Hong Kong are holding up star banners, but certainly not that of the EU, and the Union Jack is a sign of protest against Chinese oppression. Here too, the magic word is coming to terms with and overcoming one's own negative past with the aim of disposing of it completely. Against this background, it is not surprising that the history of the world wars, in which Great Britain fought to prevent German domination of the continent, must be seen in a different light. In the case of the First World War, whose contemporary witnesses are no longer present and whose horrors have been pushed into the background in the collective consciousness by the Second, the reinterpretation and reinterpretation of historical facts by figures such as Cambridge professor Christopher Clark, whose book The Sleepwalkers questions the thesis of German war guilt in the First World War, is sufficient. Instead of the urgently needed victory in a just war against Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire and the enormous sacrifices made by 7 million soldiers, mostly from the working class, there is increasingly talk of an all-round condemnation of European great power politics. Of course, this is not possible in the case of the Second World War. Because of his central role in ending the fatal appeasement policy, which contributed significantly to the Allied victory, the white, conservative, nationalist warmonger Churchill is still regarded in Britain today as one of the greatest and most important statesmen. The sections of the British left that opposed Britain's entry into the war, on the other hand, have been disavowed, and the argument that the British bomber fleet itself committed war crimes is still not as easy to popularize in Britain as it was in Dresden. The disposal of the United Kingdom's finest hour therefore takes a different route and leads directly to the ideological core of the Corbyn coalition, the anti-colonial leveling and relativization of Nazi crimes by placing them in a negative universality of European history, which is primarily understood as one of slavery and colonialism by whites against people of color and continues to this day in the racist treatment of Muslims in particular, is based on anti-Semitism enforced as a party ideology. The extent to which conspiracy mania has eaten away at the party is particularly evident in the reactions to criticism. The accusations were made with malicious intent by people who wanted to undermine Jeremy Corbyn and his new course, with people also being specified from time to time as conservative supporters, members of big business, the Israel lobby or the Israeli embassy. The former mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, has been the forerunner in this discipline. Back in 2006, he asked a Jewish journalist whether he was a German war criminal, and replied that he was Jewish and found the question offensive, saying that he was behaving like one. He responded to the accusation of anti-Semitism with the statement, "For far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who, like me, criticizes the policies of the Israeli government." Unsurprisingly, British Jews are less than enthusiastic about the prospect of a Labour government under Corbyn. The Jewish Chronicle, the oldest continuously published Jewish newspaper in the world to date, put an election appeal to all British citizens on its front page on November 8, 2019, stating, "The overwhelming majority of British Jews think Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite." In a poll last month, it was 87%. Putting yourself in the shoes of another person or group can be difficult. But we believe it is important and urgent that you do. Perhaps the fact that nearly half, 47%, of the Jewish community in the same poll said they would seriously consider leaving if Mr. Corbyn wins on December 12 gives you an indication of what it feels like to be a British Jew at a time when the official opposition is led by a man widely regarded as anti-Semitic.
End quote.
It is only consequent that this anti-Western, anti-Semitic and anti-British Labour Party is fighting tooth and nail against a sovereign and self-confident Britain and is now openly advocating a second referendum, exactly in line with former party leader Tony Blair, by the way, which it calls the people's vote with boundless audacity. This leaves only Margaret Thatcher's nasty party as a political force that could respond to the desire for sovereignty and political change. At the same time, the Tories, as advocates of opening up the markets and a classic supply-side policy while limiting national debt, are by no means the natural opponents of European treaties and agreements. It was only when the European Union (EU) was founded in 1993 by the Maastricht Treaty as a superordinate association for the European communities, the common foreign and security policy and cooperation in the areas of justice and home affairs that a notable group of conservative skeptics emerged in the form of the European Research Group, ERG. In particular, the rejection of an extended free trade area for the purpose of establishing a political union and the preparations for the introduction of a single currency met with disapproval. This was also in line with the mood of the British population, in which membership of an EU that went beyond a mere economic and trade union was not acceptable to the majority. Since then, there have been efforts from within and outside the Conservative Party to put the issue of European integration to the people in the tradition of democratic constitutional referendums since the Massachusetts referendums of 1778 and 1779. This reflects the difference between sovereignty and government, for the fundamental provisions within which elected representatives, as experts and successively as professional politicians, deal with the workings of the machinery of state and legislation and form governments. Many state theorists believe that the consent of the people, from whom all sovereignty should emanate, is necessary. The UK is a special case in that its constitutional law is partly based on conventions and regulations that would elsewhere be constitutions are treated more like statutes. This is why it is often claimed, although this is not entirely true, that the UK, unlike the USA for example, does not have a written constitution. Yet it is clear that even a constitutional state like the USA is based on conventions. It therefore depends on who writes the rules, and this is where the EU comes into play, which formally consists of coherent, constitutional structures that have an impact on the member states. However, it is not a supra or superstate and can hardly become one in legal terms. After all, it is based on the fact that each member state continues to be individually represented in some of its bodies and ultimately remains a sovereign state, for example in international organizations such as NATO, of which not all EU states are members. In this respect, the way in which national sovereignty was discussed in the course of the EU referendum is double-edged. Many of the problems that the EU has result precisely from the fact that it is not and does not want to be a sovereign state. This is particularly evident in the issue of borders. The EU is neither a state that controls its borders, nor an alliance of states that can control their own borders. The Brexit negotiations conducted by the May government, similar to the previous ones under Finance Minister Varoufakis for Greece, also showed that those with the EU are different to those with a state or a government. Where individual representatives can admit that a certain political process will not work, the EU as a whole is proving to be a bloc incapable of making concessions. Seen from the outside, the EU institutions have a supranational character, but from the perspective of each member state, they are firmly linked to the legislation of their country, which makes the EU and the hard law adopted there very different from the UN and the agreements adopted there, which can only have an effect as soft law. Although the parliament of a country can decide that EU legislation should apply, it can revoke its consent on the basis of complicated negotiations. In this respect, it is only possible for the individual state to either recognize the validity of EU legislation, or, as is the case with Brexit, to reject the entire structure in toto and leave, which is why many Brexit supporters rightly emphasize that there can be no soft Brexit. The fact that constitutionally relevant laws are passed from outside is met with resistance in the UK that is alien to the Germans, whose basic law was not only approved by the Western Allies, but also de facto introduced as the sovereign over the 3 occupation zones. The lack of legitimacy of the once provisional basic law, which has now been elevated to a constitution, continues to have an impact on the political ideas of a united Europe in that the Germans have never been consulted on integration into the EU and find this completely unproblematic in many respects. In contrast, not only the UK but also France has a long tradition of constitutional legislation through general referendums. For these countries, the disregard of the French referendum on the EU constitution in 2005, which resulted in a clear victory for opponents, particularly those on the political left, represents a turning point in the history of democracy, because the regulations were adopted in only slightly modified form as the Intergovernmental Treaty of Lisbon. The EU constitution not only restricts the sovereignty of the member states in terms of nation-states and parliaments, but also makes the possibility of social democratic reforms in favor of workers and employees considerably more difficult. It guarantees the free movement of goods, capital, labor and services, as well as freedom of establishment, and prohibits national regulations. Following a phase of overexpansion, both in terms of the number and type of new member states, Romania, Bulgaria and Croatia, recently identified as the most corrupt country in Eastern Europe, are the most extreme examples, and in terms of the expansion of powers through deeper integration via the Euro, the Lisbon Treaty, etc., the EU is facing a huge legitimacy problem. EU ideologues counter this crisis by appealing to the European project, its enormous achievements for prosperity and, above all, peace in Europe, falsely equating the continent with the organization. It is obvious that the main purpose of this constant propagandistic fire is to gloss over the EU's urgent need for reform and its simultaneous inability to be reformed. What's more, the necessity of permanently advancing integration resulting from the logic of the EU institutions and their impact on the national constitutions and the resulting loss of democratic control and political responsibility towards the supposed sovereign is presented as having no alternative. If the euro fails, Europe will fail, the German Chancellor chimes in on behalf of all the preservationists. The journalistic attacks against the UK and its politicians since the Brexit referendum are fed by the perception, unclouded by reflection, that the country is not distancing itself from the EU, but from Europe, proving once and for all that it is a reactionary, xenophobic, nationalist enemy state. Brexit is not a completely new event, as it has a historical precursor in the withdrawal from the Catholic Church and the founding of the Anglican Church under Henry VIII. Even then, the key questions were whether the continent, then represented by the Pope, could determine British law and whether Great Britain would have to pay for it. Henry sent his most important advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a staunch Catholic and opponent of separation in principle, to Rome to negotiate his divorce on the basis of the Roman demands. Only after the miserable failure of this mission did he decide to break with Rome once and for all and re-establish English sovereignty. To this day, the myth of Henry VIII is central to the idea that England is fundamentally different from the continent. The second iconic figure in English history, who has shaped the identification with the British royal house like no other and is still portrayed today as the Virgin Mother of the nation, was his daughter Elizabeth I, the founder of the empire. Henry's break with Rome lends itself as a historical reference to Britain's break with the EU, because Brussels can certainly be understood as the seat of the secularized papacy of our time. This is particularly evident in the dogma of infallibility, by means of which the EU is elevated to the guardian of the holy grail of democracy, which Jean-Claude Juncker has repeatedly made clear with remarkable openness. In 2015, for example, he declared to the Greeks, "There can be no democratic choice against the European treaties." He told French voters before the vote on the EU constitution, If the result is yes, we will continue on our path, and if it is no, we will continue. Western secularism, democracy, and the idea of human rights, the European values as a whole, are themselves a Christian creation, as numerous philosophers and historians now recognize. However, establishing a basis that is compatible or at least comparable with the Christian faith has failed. The European jargon of democracy and human rights is thus increasingly at odds with the EU's inability to live up to its goals and is therefore, like the papacy, ultimately doomed to failure. The reign of the well-educated music and literature enthusiast Henry VIII not only founded modern Britain in contrast to continental Europe, but also the heyday of the British Renaissance and the golden age of English literature and music under his daughter Elizabeth. At the same time, it formed the basis for enormous social and economic progress, which was central to the formation of the First British Empire, 1583 to 1783. It is unlikely that such glorious times lie ahead for Britain after Brexit. The fact that the Brexit decision, with 17.4 million votes, represents the largest democratic mandate in British history, but has still not been implemented by Parliament, and that the British will elect a new Parliament for the third time in less than 5 years in December 2019, makes it clear that the Brexit crisis is one of representative democracy as a whole. This is fundamentally based on the idea that the people elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf. The authority of MPs is based on the will of their constituents, who merely delegate their powers to them. In 2016, however, Parliament decided that it could not decide on the EU itself and returned the decision-making power to the supposed sovereign. Regardless of whether referendums are legally more of an advisory nature, the vote for Brexit was politically binding. However, if Parliament ignores the result, it fatally undermines its own authority, as it makes it clear that the will of the people is meaningless and thus also calls into question the basis on which MPs are elected. This was still understood in 2016, when every politician warned that the decision would be final and both government and opposition promised that they would implement whatever was decided. The legalistic insistence on parliamentary sovereignty that followed seemed correspondingly hollow. Parliament referred the decision back to the people, the EU Withdrawal Act was passed, and in 2017, 85% of MPs were elected on manifestos promising to respect the referendum result. The subsequent refusal of the broken parliament that emerged from the 2017 election to enact Brexit shows many Britons exactly what they had long suspected, that political representation in the UK no longer works. When millions of people who have no political power beyond their vote cannot pursue change through representative politics, they must either withdraw from public life or seek other means. However, the consequent rise of so-called populists, which in the end means little more than the Latin translation of Democrats, has not led to a demand for democratic reform politics among the culturally and politically dominant class, but has rather boosted the old call for philosophers' rule, for example in the form of requirements such as proof of political education in order to be granted the right to vote. Fear of the voter and democratic rhetoric that has degenerated into jargon are the ideological core of a union that is more than a confederation of states, but cannot and does not want to be a European nation-state. It is more obvious to see it as a timeless and placeless non-state, which is expressed not only in the isolated EU district on the outskirts of a city where Islamic terror cells thrive, but above all in the refusal to constitute a parliament in a fixed location at all, which cannot be explained by any practical reason. The widespread anger at the numerous regulations passed in Brussels and transposed into national legislation obscures the fact that it is not state administration and control of capitalism, but deregulation, safeguarding the 4 economic freedoms and permanent mobilization for ever more absurd purposes that constitute the EU's program. Bringing political processes back to a concrete political and historical place like Westminster is not enough to overcome the resulting political devastation. The fact that Boris Johnson repeats his campaign slogan, "Get Brexit done," like a mantra suggests that he wants to return to the usual conservative policy with slight cosmetic corrections. A few million for the NHS, a few adjustments to migration policy, a few additional police officers, a little more money for education, and a few tax cuts do not seem very ambitious. Although there would be room for fundamental change with Brexit, its appointed executor, a radical democratic and patriotic, decidedly pro-British force, is nowhere in sight, neither in Parliament nor at the universities or in other ideological circles. However, this is countered by the not inconsiderable willingness of many Britons to show real resilience, as was most recently demonstrated on November 29, when passers-by once again attacked and overpowered an Islamic terrorist on London Bridge, who stabbed himself with a knife and killed 2 people. Such courage is also an expression of the refusal of a counter-movement of patriotic Britons, ranging from the working class to conservative historians, to submit to globalization and Islamization as a supposedly inevitable fate. However, it is meant with derision Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg in large parts of the British and throughout the German public, because unlike Theresa May, these two supposed yesteryears have largely understood the overt and covert reasons for the desire for Britain to leave the EU, especially the well-founded skepticism against German policies not only in the Greek and refugee crisis. Starting with their education at Eton and Oxford, they still embody, for better or for worse, the old England that their opponents want to drive out, not despite, but because the country must preserve this historical legacy in order to have a future. In a speech to the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. in July 2024, J.D. Vance, the Republican candidate for vice president, speculated on which Islamic country could become the first nuclear power. In addition to Iran and Pakistan, Vance also named the United Kingdom as a candidate due to the takeover of the government by the Labour Party in May. He received applause from the Republican audience in attendance, but the media response was scathing. At first glance, Vance's verdict does indeed seem rather contrived. Under the traditional left-wing anti-imperialist Jeremy Corbyn, the predecessor of the new Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Labour had undoubtedly developed into an openly anti-Zionist and pro-Islamist party. Corbyn's display of sympathy for anti-Semites associated with Hamas and Hezbollah prompted some British Jews to seriously consider emigrating. However, the policies of the Corbyn supporters led to resistance even among some Labour supporters, not least because of their heavy-handedness, and after Labour lost the elections in December 2019, the dominance of the Corbynistas was over, which finally manifested itself in Corbyn's expulsion. Keir Starmer, who has led the party since April 2020, adopted a deliberately moderate tone and set in motion a process of renewal that was accompanied by numerous resignations by local Labour politicians of Muslim origin following the Hamas massacre on October 7, who accused Starmer of supporting genocide in Gaza despite his distant stance towards Israel. If we take a closer look at whether J.D. Vance's provocative words can simply be dismissed as humbug, it becomes apparent that Labour's pact with Islamists, despite the resignations, can by no means be dismissed as a peculiarity of the relatively short Corbyn era. During this time, it became particularly clear due to the strident anti-Western tones. The basis for the pact dates back to the 1980s, and there are indications that direct cooperation with Islamist organizations will even intensify since Labour has been in government. The results of the July 2024 election show that the party is more reliant than ever on the Muslim vote. In addition, the government wants to step up the fight against Islamophobia, in response to the Southport riots in August 2024, which also targeted mosques. As the past has shown, such measures do not strengthen Muslim women trapped in patriarchal structures, but primarily the influence of self-appointed community leaders who monitor compliance with Islamic patriarchal rules. After the end of the Second World War, the composition of the once 99% white United Kingdom changed due to immigration from the former colonies. The London district of Notting Hill was already dominated by immigrants from various regions by the mid-1950s. In 1958, the first ethnic riots took place, in which so-called Teddy boys, white working-class youths, fought brawls with black immigrants. The latter were mainly Afro-Caribbeans from former British Caribbean states such as Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago. Until the 1980s, the term black was defined very broadly in the British debate. The numerous immigrants from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh were subsumed under it, as were Afro-Caribbeans and other people with African roots. In contrast to today, it was characteristic of this term to push the religion of the immigrants into the background, which largely corresponded to the self-image of Muslim immigrants, who at that time did not yet declare their Muslim identity to be the center of their existence, but often, like many others, wanted to see themselves primarily as black workers and thus also as part of the British working class. This was possible against the backdrop of a particularly class-oriented Fordist industrial society, which has long since ceased to exist in Great Britain, as everywhere else in the West. It was no coincidence that ethnically motivated riots occurred regularly in the late 1970s and early 1980s when Fordist Keynesian society was in crisis. In 1981, these were particularly violent, as the Thatcher government had responded to increasing violence and crime, particularly in the immigrant neighborhoods of major cities, with its Stop and Search Act, which gave the police more powers to stop people. The violence among immigrants in turn boosted the militant neo-fascist camp, whose regular marches resulted in clashes with counter-demonstrators. This development was caused not least by high youth unemployment and the associated no-future mood. It was no coincidence that punk was at its peak at the time. Despite all the criticism of neoliberal Thatcherism with its closure of entire branches of industry, the dismantling of workers' rights and deregulation and privatization, Thatcher's post-Fordist restructuring of society into what was later called a service society caused both unemployment figures and crime to fall. In addition, in response to the riots, the Thatcher government invested money in the regeneration of run-down inner cities. As a result, the late 1980s and 1990s were much quieter. But this is only half the story, because something that Kenan Malik points out in his book From Fatwa to Jihad, for example, was just as responsible for the social pacification under post-Fordist or neoliberal auspices. The policy of involving ethnic groups in political processes, later referred to as multiculturalism, in which the Greater London Council, led by Ken Livingstone, played a pioneering role and acted as a pilot project in the first half of the 1980s. The Greater London Council, GLC, was the governing authority of Greater London until it was abolished by Margaret Thatcher in 1986. In 1981, the Labour politician Ken Livingstone, known as Red Ken, who belonged to the left wing of the party, was elected chairman. Livingstone tried to counter the Thatcher government's policy of austerity as much as possible. Among other things, he created an ethnic minority unit with the aim of improving the living conditions of ethnic minorities in London. In this way, many millions of pounds flowed to ethnic groups and associations over the next 5 years. Of particular importance here is the process by which it was determined which interests and institutions were worthy of support. To this end, the Ethnic Minority Unit organized consultation meetings with representatives of the various ethnic communities. On average, fewer than 40 people attended these meetings. The GLC nevertheless regarded such small groups as the authentic voice of the community, and gave them considerable influence in determining the most pressing needs of the communities they represented, including the selection of appropriate leaders. The identity politics notion that there could be such a thing as the interests of Pakistani, Indian or Afro-Caribbean communities as such, and that these could be adequately represented by unelected community leaders, was as absurd then as it is today. In the UK, the GLC model quickly became a model for other cities with Labour governments and large ethnic communities, such as Bradford and Birmingham. While quite a few of the protagonists at the time may have been motivated by genuinely idealistic intentions to improve the situation of minorities suffering from racism, hard labor realpolitik always played a central role. Pervez Khan, who grew up in Birmingham in the 1960s and 1970s, told Malik for his book that recruiting clan elders could deliver the votes en masse, and that this was the real aim of Labour. On election day, elders could simply instruct their clan members to vote for their candidate, Khan told Malik. The policies of the GLC and its imitators were based on the fiction of homogeneous ethnic communities with unified group interests. From then on, only those who explicitly presented such projects as ethnic and tailored to the interests of their own community could hope to receive financial support for projects such as community centres from official bodies. Instead of a civil society of free and equal individuals, British cities soon resembled a patchwork of ethnically defined and non-overlapping cultures whose supposed common interests were represented by self-appointed spokespersons. There was no provision for breaking out of the compulsory community of the collective. The domination-securing character of multiculturalism was already evident when it was introduced in the 1980s. Even in northern English working-class towns like Bradford, unemployment was rampant at the time and there was no upturn in sight. The city was full of young, unemployed men, many of them black, and Bradford City Council was understandably concerned that the situation could escalate. In her 1987 book, travel writer Dervla Murphy reported that young people in the Pakistani community were beginning to turn away from Islam. This so displeased the leaders of the Pakistani community that they suggested the city council fund various explicitly Islamic institutions and counselors, such as youth clubs and social workers. This, they argued, could lead the rebellious youth back to Islam and thus pacify them. Naturally, those in power in Bradford were happy to accept this proposal. Even then, hardly anyone asked the obvious question of whether improving economic conditions would be a better long-term solution instead of more Islam. 2001 saw the first major riots in Oldham, near Manchester, Leeds, and Bradford. At first glance, these appeared to follow the familiar pattern of the 1980s, as police violence and marches by fascist groups such as the British National Party were again the cause. However, in an analysis of the riots, Arun Nani already points to a new problem dimension that was a consequence of multicultural urban policy. Since the 1980s, leadership strata of representatives had emerged within the various communities who saw themselves as the voice of their ethnically defined areas of power. The resulting inter-ethnic competition for state funding caused the community, which previously fell under the term black, to break up into potentially hostile subgroups. It is therefore not surprising that a new type of riot occurred in 2005. In the immigrant-heavy Birmingham neighborhoods of Lozells and Handsworth, a rumor of an alleged gang rape of an Afro-Caribbean girl by Pakistani men spread in late October. This rumor was enough to trigger 3 days of rioting between the Afro-Caribbean and Pakistani communities, resulting in the deaths of 2 people. Quite a few took the riots as an opportunity to point to the ghettoization of ethnic communities through the policy of multiculturalism as their cause. Since then, however, the problem has only worsened. That same year, against the backdrop of the concerted Islamist attacks of July 7, which left 52 dead and over 700 injured, New Labour decided as a preventative counterterrorism measure to revive an old imperial model for dealing with troubled communities, this time as a domestic pacification strategy, a deal with self-appointed community leaders. As part of the prevent counterterrorism strategy, the state began to cooperate with Islamic proxy organizations in the hope that their representatives would uncover and report planned attacks. This approach was disastrous in several respects. The continuation, if you will, of colonial policies in post-colonial times meant that the state allowed allied community leaders to run their communities as they see fit in return. In an evaluation of the Prevent program in 2023, William Shawcross also found that state money had gone to a civil society organization sympathetic to the Taliban. And ultimately, there were many more Islamist attacks, such as the suicide bombing during an Ariana Grande concert at Manchester Arena in 2017. One important reason for Prevent's lack of effectiveness is the unwillingness to take Islamist terrorism seriously at all. Former employee Charlotte Littlewood reports that her engagement against Islamists was internally rebuked as an unhealthy obsession. Neither Blair's Labour successor Gordon Brown nor the Tories who succeeded him have fundamentally changed this disastrous policy. The close ties between the Labour Party and particularly Islamic ethnic representative organizations initiated by the GLC in the 1980s were cemented by the state with a proclamation of New Labour under Tony Blair, who made the Third Way conceived by Anthony Giddens, consisting of a continuation of Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal economic reforms and multicultural communitarianism, the irreversible British social programme. In the 1990s, a number of institutions were founded at national level with the claim to act as representatives of British Muslims. Particularly successful was the Muslim Council of Britain (MCB), whose first Secretary-General, Iqbal Sakrani, criticized the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, arguing that death was too pleasant a fate for Rushdie. After the change of government in 1997, the Blair government declared the MCB the de facto official representative of Muslim interests and worked closely with it. Ken Livingstone also made a name for himself again in London. In 2000, the office of mayor was reintroduced there and Red Ken, who was far to the left of Tony Blair, became the first incumbent from 2000 to 2008. After the start of the Second Intifada and the attack on the World Trade Center, large demonstrations against the war in Afghanistan, Iraq and Israel's alleged oppression of the Palestinians regularly took place in London. In addition to the traditionally anti-American and anti-Zionist left, many Muslims also took part. Livingstone saw this as having the potential to secure a loyal voter base. On the one hand, he publicly described George Bush and Ariel Sharon as war criminals, and on the other, he began to cooperate with the Muslim Association of Britain (MAB), which is regarded as the British offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. This approach seemed to work at first. In 2004, an Islamic scholar close to the MAB declared in a fatwa that while it was appropriate for Muslims to vote, making an electoral decision requires such a deep and thorough understanding of the political landscape that the responsibility for it is better left to relevant Muslim organizations, such as the MAB. The vote for Livingstone was thus backed by an Islamic legal opinion. In the end, the plan did not work out despite its self-confident claim to represent the entirety of British Muslims. The MAB was obviously not in an organizational position to deliver votes effectively. Moreover, Livingstone's pro-Islamist policies had alienated many other pro-Labour voters. A meeting in 2004 between Livingstone and the scholar Yusuf al-Qaradawi, known from the Al Jazeera program Sharia and Life, whom Livingstone described as a moderate representative of Islam, made negative headlines when numerous anti-Semitic and anti-gay statements by al-Qaradawi were made public. In 2008, Livingstone lost the election to his challenger Boris Johnson. In the British general election in spring 2024, the Muslim vote was once again fiercely contested. This time, the MAB achieved a clear victory. Together with the Islamist organization Muslim Engagement and Development, it organized the Muslim Vote Campaign, which aimed to put up non-partisan candidates in constituencies with a high Muslim population and bring them into the House of Representatives. The campaign was primarily directed against the local Labour candidates, who were accused of being too pro-Israel in the current Gaza war. Many of the candidates, known as Gaza independents, were conspicuous for their anti-Semitic statements. During the election campaign, there were ugly scenes such as the storming of a Labour event by masked men. 4 of the candidates entered the House of Commons in July. They were joined by Jeremy Corbyn, who won his London constituency of Islington North as an independent candidate against the Labour Party, which had been victorious there without interruption since 1937. A cursory glance at the election results suggests that an exodus of traditionally Labour-loyal Muslim voters should not worry the leadership under Keir Starmer. Labour has an overwhelming majority in Parliament with 411 out of 650 seats. But appearances are deceptive, because due to the British first-past-the-post system, this majority of seats by no means corresponds to a particularly high share of the vote. In 2019, Labour spectacularly lost a number of constituencies known as the Red Wall in the north of England to the Tories, as the majority of Brexit-supporting residents resented Labour's ambivalent stance on leaving the EU. Brexit became a reality, but the ruling Conservatives did little to improve the poor economic situation in the former industrial cities. In 2024, the Red Wall is now back in Labour hands, but frustration with the Tories has by no means brought a large proportion of voters back to Labour. The share of the vote in the constituencies won back only rose from 38% to 41%. A full 22% of votes went to Reform UK, a right-wing populist party supported by Nigel Farage, which was founded in 2018 as the Brexit Party. Reform UK even achieved a majority in 5 constituencies and now has just as many MPs in the House of Commons. Labour's landslide victory is based more on the fragmentation of the opposing parties and the peculiarities of the British electoral system than the intrinsic appeal of the party. A further drift of both Muslim and white working-class voters would seriously jeopardise the party's power base. The most effective means of winning back both constituencies is likely to be a social policy that seriously improves living conditions, particularly in the northern parts of the country. In view of the poor state finances, however, this is unlikely to happen. One of Starmer's first austerity measures was to cancel state co-payments for heating costs for pensioners, a highly unpopular measure that the Tories would certainly not have dared to implement for fear of alienating their most loyal voters. And even if the state's coffers were full, it would be difficult to see how the isolated parts of the country could be regenerated without serious reindustrialization, which in turn is difficult to reconcile with a declared goal of carbon reduction in the name of climate protection. Cultural and identity policy measures offer a cost-effective alternative. However, Labour has little to offer the white working class, who are often derided in the media as gamins, hams, an insult aimed at the complexion of a white person who expresses their opinion with reddened cheeks in a mixture of anger and zeal. Former human rights lawyer Starmer, an establishment man through and through, is as such unlikely to win back the confidence of the fit-styled, Reform UK-inclined residents of depressed industrial and coastal towns. Compared to other Labour politicians, Starmer is comparatively restrained in his statements on topics such as transgender issues, which meet with little understanding among this socially conservative clientele, but remarks such as that 99.9% of women don't have a penis are likely to have done more harm than good. The new government is actively countering accusations of being pro-Israel. Since Foreign Secretary David Lammy took office, the British tone towards Israel has become much harsher. For example, the Conservative government froze British payments to UNRWA after October 7, 2023. Immediately after the change of government, however, payments were resumed in July 2024, and in addition to a statement in Parliament, Lammy also used a speech at the Labour Party conference to explicitly and publicly praise this decision. In September, Lammy also banned the export of some types of weapons and weapon parts to Israel. As arms imports from the UK play a minor role for Israel, this decision has little practical impact, but its symbolic significance is all the greater. A tougher stance on Israel is obviously intended to prevent a further loss of seats in Muslim-dominated constituencies. The state of the country can also be seen in the reaction to the riots that took place in the northern English coastal town of Southport at the end of July and quickly spread to the rest of the country. A Taylor Swift-themed yoga and dance workshop in Southport ended tragically on July 29. 17-year-old Axel Rudakubana began stabbing the participants and killed 3 girls. Rudakubana is a British citizen and was born in Cardiff, Wales. His parents originally come from Rwanda, which is predominantly Christian. Nevertheless, rumors spread like wildfire in Southport and the surrounding area that the perpetrator was a Muslim illegal immigrant and that the attack was Islamist motivated. On the evening of July 30th, violent riots broke out in front of the mosque in Southport. The police largely kept the hundreds of white demonstrators at bay, but a police van was set on fire and a retail store was damaged. By 11 p.m. the riot was over, but over the next few days there were further riots in other, mainly northern English cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Hartlepool, Middlesbrough, and Stoke-on-Trent. In several cases, hotels housing asylum seekers and mosques were targeted. The police and judiciary took swift and decisive action. On August 5th, almost 400 participants were already in custody and hearings were held in court. Just 2 days later, on August 7th, the first sentences were handed down against 3 men involved in the riots in Southport and Liverpool. Throughout August and September, further sentences were handed down in quick succession, and these were by no means limited to those directly involved in the attempted attacks on mosques, stores, and hotels. A 28-year-old man from Leeds was sentenced to 20 months in prison for writing inflammatory Facebook posts, a first in British judicial history. The case of Julie Sweeney received greater media attention. Sweeney, who lives in a tranquil northern English village far from the riots and had spent the last few years caring for her sick husband at home, was sentenced to 15 months in prison for a Facebook post calling for mosques to be blown up. Sweeney had posted the racist message in a local Facebook group for residents of her village of around 2,500 people, which usually features ads for cake baking and driveway renovations. It is unlikely that this actually incited anyone to violent action, but as a spokesperson for Cheshire Police made clear, the severity of the sentence was intended to send a message that there is no place for hate posters to hide, and that we will find them and hold them to account. A swift and consequent condemnation of people who want to set fire to mosques or asylum shelters is of course to be welcomed. There is no reason to gloss over the hatred posted online by Sweeney and others. But the fact that keyboard warriors like Sweeney actually end up in prison points to a worrying trend in recent years: the criminalization of so-called hate speech. The UK already has a stricter approach to this than many other Western countries, and there is a real danger that the definition of what constitutes hate speech will be widened. The Scottish government is an inglorious vanguard here. With the Scottish Hate Crime Act, which came into force in April 2024, not only threats are now considered potential hate crimes, but also statements that can be considered offensive. Furthermore, it is no longer necessary to prove an intention to incite hatred for a conviction, but merely that this is a likely consequence of the statement. The Hate Crime Act also makes short work of the traditional British motto "My home is my castle." Previously, private spaces such as your own living room were exempt from hate speech regulation as part of the so-called dwelling defence. In Scotland, the entry into force of the Hate Crime Act turned into a farce. On the first day, a total of 3,800 hate crimes were reported to the police, the majority of which were directed against J.K. Rowling and the then First Minister of Scotland Humza Yousaf, who had supported the new regulation. However, the political will to crack down on hate speech by the police is clearly unbroken in the UK. The large number of convictions following the Southport riots is all the more remarkable given that the British prison system is already in deep crisis. Prisons across the country are overcrowded, and immediately after taking office, Starmer realized that the situation was even worse than expected. In response, his cabinet decided on a large-scale release operation. 1,700 prisoners were released early on September 10, with 5,500 to be released by October. According to the government, this will not pose a serious threat to the population, as serious violent criminals and sex offenders are exempt from release. However, at least by mistake, some prisoners who had violated no-contact regulations were nevertheless released. Elon Musk stirred up the debate immediately after the riots were contained and the legal prosecution of the perpetrators began. He accused Keir Starmer of two-tier justice. The accusation was quickly dismissed as a conspiracy theory by the left liberal media. In its crudest form, there is certainly little to be gained from the thesis that there is class justice against the white and for the non-white population in the United Kingdom. But Musk's tweets were not as crude as he claimed. The incidents he refers to show that at least the related accusation of two-tier policing is certainly justified. On August 5, a rumor spread in Birmingham that right-wing organizations from the former English Defence League were planning to attack mosques in the Bordesley Green district. On the evening of that day, a large crowd gathered outside a McDonald's restaurant in defense of the local Muslim community. The rumors were obviously false. At least racist provocateurs stayed away. Nevertheless, the atmosphere was heated. Much of the crowd was masked, Palestinian flags were waved, and some participants were later convicted for the unauthorized possession of weapons. Several media representatives were threatened. During a report for Sky News, a man wearing a balaclava approached the presenter and shouted curses and "Free Palestine" into the camera. After the recording ended, the man followed the broadcasting team and tried to slash the tires of the broadcasting vehicle with a knife. A team from the LBC radio station, led by Fraser Knight, had a similar experience. Immediately after arriving in Bordesley Green, they were loudly asked to leave the area by passers-by. Knight reports that a short time later a group of 6 men appeared carrying an iron bar, whereupon a chase ensued and the radio team fled to the safety of the town centre. Finally, Sean McDonough, a patron of the Clumsy Swan pub who was on the terrace, was attacked by passing protectors of the community. A video shows a mob of masked youths, several of them carrying Palestinian flags, kicking McDonough. According to later reports, McDonough provoked the crowd. He was then banned from visiting the pub by the operator, who attaches great importance to maintaining good contact with the Islamic community. There were hardly any police officers to be seen on this eventful evening. Individual patrol cars drove past the crowd, and the police should therefore have quickly realized that some of those present were armed. The attack on Sean McDonough, for example, was not stopped by police officers, but by other participants in the protection march. The following day, Emlyn Richards, a spokesman for West Midlands Police, declared this a success without further ado. There had been a prior discussion between the police and community and business leaders, i.e. leading members of the Muslim community, in which the form of the police action required on the evening of August 5 was discussed. They came to the conclusion that the majority of participants would be peaceful and that it should therefore be left largely to the community itself to ensure security and order. There is no equivalent for the non-ethnic majority society, for this great right of self-appointed spokespersons of ethnic communities to have a say in questions of local security and administration. The claim made by fact-checkers that there is nothing to the two-tier policing theory is therefore likely to further undermine confidence in the state, which has already been weakened by the structures established in the 1980s, in view of numerous analogous cases. Since the riots in August, the containment of Islamophobia has once again become a topic of discussion. As early as 2006, the Religious Hatred Act, RHA, explicitly criminalized incitement to violence against persons on religious grounds in the United Kingdom. For some time now, many have considered the RITA to be too lax, as it does not explicitly target Islamophobia. In 2015, an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, APPG, was therefore set up, which 2 years later proposed the following definition of Islamophobia in a report: Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a form of racism directed against expressions of Muslimness or perceived expressions of Muslimness.
End quote.
There is probably no need to explain that this would de facto amount to a ban on criticism of Islam as a criminal offense. Following the launch of the APPG definition, the women's rights organization Southall Black Sisters warned of a worsening situation for Muslim women and girls, as state institutions already prefer to stay out of culturally sensitive matters such as honor killings or forced marriages for fear of accusations of racism. Many major organizations, including the Labour Party, have now adopted the APPG definition. However, it has not yet received the consecration of state recognition. However, in response to the Southport riots, Starmer has announced that he is seriously considering this. He could be sure of applause from the left liberal elite who read The Guardian and the London Review of Books. A large majority of this traditional Labour milieu, like Daniel Trilling of the LRB blog, is likely to see the cause of the Southport riots primarily in the Islamophobic policies of the previous Johnson, Truss, Sunak government. Trilling cited, among others, the last Tory Home Secretary Sala Braverman, who had described the regular joint pro-Palestinian mass demonstrations by leftists and Islamists in London since October 7 as hate marches. Two of many examples should prove that she was absolutely right. In April 2024, Gideon Falter, head of the campaign against anti-Semitism, was stopped by the police while walking near a demonstration and prevented from continuing. The reason? His obviously Jewish appearance thanks to his kippah and visible Star of David. An officer told him that his presence would turn a large number of people against him and therefore constituted a breach of the public peace. Falter was threatened with arrest if he remained on the spot. This did not happen, but the Iranian dissident Nayak Gorbani had actually been arrested a month earlier. He had also allegedly disturbed the public peace by carrying around a poster with the words "Hamas is terrorist," thus turning the demonstrators against him. In this context, an anti-fascist demonstration against the Southport riots in London in August 2024, which was advertised with the slogan "Fascists, Racists, Nazis, Zionists and Islamophobes out of Finchley," should not go unmentioned. It is conceivable that even waving Palestine flags and shouting "Free Palestine" could pass as the APPG definition of Islamophobia states, expressions of Muslimness, and therefore any public objection or protest against it would already constitute Islamophobia. Even now, the accusation of paying too little respect to Islam can have devastating consequences. In March 2021, a religious education teacher held a lesson on blasphemy and freedom of speech at a school in the small English town of Batley. As in previous years, he showed a caricature of Muhammad, among other things. Following complaints from the parents of a pupil, this came to the attention of the Muslim Action Forum, an activist group founded in 2012, which considers depictions of Muhammad to be the worst hate crime that can be committed against Muslims. The teacher's name was made public and he subsequently received numerous death threats, forcing him and his family to go into hiding. Although the teaching materials were part of the official school curriculum, the school administration suspended the teacher and publicly apologized for showing inappropriate material. This apology was welcomed by local politicians. Despite death threats, the police showed little engagement in supporting the teacher and his family, despite the bestial murder of teacher Samuel Party in France just a few months earlier. As an independent report from 2024 shows, the police and school in the Batley case also cooperated uncritically with the hardliners who had appointed themselves as community leaders and prioritized their appeasement. Something similar could be observed in an incident in Wakefield in February 2023. A 14-year-old autistic pupil had brought a Quran to school as part of a test of courage and read from it with his friends. During a later scuffle, the Quran fell to the floor and was slightly crushed. The pupils involved were then suspended because, according to Principal Griffiths, they did not treat the Quran with the respect it deserved. The police were also called and the incident was registered as a hate incident. Rumors quickly spread that the Quran had been set on fire or spat on, whereupon the boy received death threats. Instead of investigating these, however, the police were apparently more interested in appeasing the local Imam Hafiz Anwar. At a joint press conference, Anwar declared that he would defend the honor of the Quran, no matter the cost, and would even sacrifice his life for it, which the representatives of the school, police, and the city who were present apparently had nothing to object to. If you want to grasp the self-destructive status quo of British society, all you need to do is look at the way genital mutilation is treated, which undermines even its own law. It has been illegal since 1985, but as of 2019 no one has been convicted of it. The fear that enforcing the law could be seen as Islamophobic trumped the duty to protect the predominantly Muslim women and girls. It may be seen as positive that the first conviction for conspiracy to commit female genital mutilation was handed down in early October 2024. However, to see this as the beginning of the end of subjugation in the name of multiculturalism would be nothing more than misplaced optimism that glosses over the unmistakable tendencies towards self-abolition in British society, and thus only helps to perpetuate them. Land Own Hers was the title of a bestseller from the Nazi era. Maslow's Continent was another of many that had only one thing in mind: to paint the Anglo-Saxon countries as a cesspool of selfishness, a home of depraved souls, a hell of social conflict and ruthless brutality. Especially in August 2011, it sounds familiar how the Nazi authors denounced the USA, but also England, as countries with huge social problems, in which an irresponsible, greedy oligarchy had created an equally depraved underclass, whose lack of culture was driven to extremes by the racial mishmash. Hitler himself was succinct in his assessment of urban America, which was dominated by an English-inflected plutocracy. Quote, "It is an inwardly rotten country with racial problems and social inequality, a country without ideas. My feelings for America are full of hatred and repugnance, half Judaized, half neglected, and all based on the dollar."
End quote.
Vergedet disappeared as an invective from journalistic language after 1945, and yet German views of the heartless countries in the West have otherwise changed little. The commentaries on the riots that broke out in almost all the poorer districts of English cities after the shooting of Mark Duggan by police officers on August 4 and a protest march in the London district of Tottenham on August 6 demonstrated this more than clearly. Hardly any journalist refrained from interpreting the images of shoplifting, street robbery, arson, coercion, and assault in the traditional way. The talk was always that a society that pays homage to mammon like the British should not be surprised if the underclass behaved just as materialistically as a callous upper class. The Süddeutsche Zeitung, October 8, 2011, painted the traditional picture of perfidious Albion most clearly. Quote, "Homeowners elsewhere may no longer be able to service their mortgages, but prices for penthouse apartments in Knightsbridge or Kensington continue to rise sharply. The diamond dealers in Hatton Garden, the men's outfitters in Jermyn Street, and the luxury car salesmen on Park Lane are not complaining about dwindling demand. And while Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne is cutting social benefits with one hand, with the other he is luring rich people from all over the world into the country with conditions that would make the finance director of a Swiss low-tax Canton green with envy. This is the background against which the riots across the slums of the British capital and in other parts of the country must be viewed."
End quote.
And so the SC commentator Wolfgang Keudel continues, "This does not turn the rioters of Tottenham and Peckham into a social or even revolutionary movement. Anyone who torches supermarkets, loots cell phone stores and attacks police officers with pickaxes is acting criminally and must be treated like a criminal. Nevertheless, the riots are an indication of a broader, deeper malaise. But this nation is breaking apart because of its contradictions and injustice. In no other European state is inequality so cemented as in the kingdom."
End of quote.
The fact that this fact actually only describes a gradual and not a significant difference to the situation in other European states is irrelevant in such a swada, because the statistically measurable differences in quality of life and life expectancy between Munich Grunwald and Berlin Wedding are probably only insignificantly smaller than those between London Mayfair and Liverpool Toxteth. In any case, The social difference between the United Kingdom and Germany does not lie in the fact that the under 30 population of impoverished immigrant urban districts in particular is virtually excluded from social participation through traditional wage labor. This is just as true for both countries as it is for France or Italy. And so it is not surprising that none of the countless German-language commentators can provide an explanation for the nationwide synchronicity of the riots, for the apparently similar social structures and mental dispositions in over 50 different places in the country, which would go beyond an authoritarian lament with a more or less traditional anti-English orientation. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for example, calls for more discipline in schools on August 19, 2011 and criticizes a child-centered pedagogy that has spread in the UK even to those institutions that still stand for discipline and a clear value system. The Handelsblatt remains more sober in headlines on September 8, 2011, the pressure to cut costs is fueling violence.
Günther Lachenmann concludes in Die Welt on 11. August
2011 that the only thing that can help against this is more state money, as it used to be called in autonomous speak, for everything and everyone, and analyzes, what the Western world is currently experiencing is the disappearance of responsible politics. Power has long since gone to where the money is. Politics has given it away without need and has taken refuge in a bitter delusion that can only be maintained by shutting out reality.
End of quote.
In this perspective of status nostalgia, correct observations such as the fact that there are thousands and thousands of families in formerly industrial cities and districts who are already the third generation to live on social welfare are often lost. Headlines such as Offer der Abschankten SC, Aufstand der Frustrierten Spiegel or Der Aufstand der Verlierer FAZ show no critical insight into the nature of socio-political segregation, but rather only the creepy prospect for the commentator that the containment of social problem zones will fail, and in such a way that the violence and panic there may no longer only affect the inmates of those neighborhoods and thus their schools and offices on a daily basis. In any case, the left-wing notion that the budget cuts agreed by the British government in the spring were the tacit trigger for the August riots implies that there would be no riots if only there were a little more social welfare, a slightly less poor healthcare system, or a few more social workers and educational institutions. This in turn means, however, that the living situation that Rizwan Ahmed, an eloquent resident of Tottenham, aptly described to the BBC as caging, can be declared tolerable and appropriate, provided that this cage remains adequately equipped, in other words, to preserve the underclass as eternally passive recipients of transfers and thus as an employment environment for the very own pedagogical clientele. Blackberries are an aid, but their availability is by no means the reason for the synchronicity of the outbreaks of violence in August. Rather, it was the equality of living conditions in the affected neighborhoods that caused them. In communitarian England, the inhabitants of unpopular urban areas are kept under lock and key where they have already been forced to live for decades. John Carpenter's dystopian vision of the future, which he projected in his 1981 film The Rattlesnake, almost automatically comes to mind. Manhattan here is a sealed-off open-air prison that is fed from the outside but governs itself and therefore reverts to a seemingly primal state of gang warfare. Now, unlike Carpenter's film Manhattan, Tottenham is not separated from the rest of the country by high walls and blown-up bridges, and yet Rizwana Hamid's image of the cage applies. She is referring to life in politically enforced communities, into which individuals are effectively locked until they manage to earn enough to move away. Otherwise, they remain chained like caged animals, Hamid, to their milieu of origin, because the whole range of social policy instruments is tailored to the community and administered by local agencies, on behalf of the state, whether it is housing benefits, social welfare, health services, or even police powers. This development has neither occurred naturally nor been quietly driven forward. No, radical communitarianism was the trumpeted agenda of New Labour, with which Blair and Brown's party won the 1997 election. The right to be a member of a functioning community is one of the most important rights of the individual. The central social value is inclusion, much more than the equality sought by the old left or the individual autonomy of the new right, Blair emphasized in an election campaign speech at the time, and as the newly elected head of government, got straight down to work. A complicated web of independent welfare agencies, state coordination bodies, local advisory boards and so-called community leaders emerged, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, a network of local partnerships in which the welfare state made use of existing, or even imagined communitarian structures to remedy the notorious funding crisis of social policy by means of culture. Governed by culture is now a common social science term to describe New Labour social policy health action zones. Education action zones and employment zones have since 1998 enclosed and defined the very neighborhoods where the flames were blazing that summer. For Blair's New Deal for communities was anything but a mere paper tiger, but rather pursued its goal in a consequent manner, namely the most cost-effective delegation of previously central government social tasks. Above all, the uncle economy of the Pakistani and West Indian neighborhoods could now, with official approval, absorb the almost unsaleable labor of young people elsewhere and otherwise place them back under close social control. How and what goes on in the process, what the financially and organizationally supported and strengthened community is actually like inside. All this should then no longer have to interest the deliberately multicultural state. On the contrary, the then new Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer and later Prime Minister Gordon Brown defined the modern British nation as a community of communities at the Millennium celebrations in 2000. British political advisors are just as candid about the advantages and disadvantages of governing through localization. The Reinvention of Communities is the title of John Clarke's summary of Blair's turn towards governing through social spaces. Quote, "The communities are ascribed authority, efficiency and effectiveness, conceived as political and moral actors. Communities require the attention, respect and interest of government apparatuses and their personnel. Consultation, participation and co-governing processes are essential elements of new labor for the modernization of governance. At the same time, the communities represent reservoirs of values, agreements, resources and capacities that can be activated in the process of co-governing. Among other things, such activation can have the additional effect of reducing the costs of public welfare production. At certain points, these are supplemented by the concept of an identity community. In these places are the multicultural and distinctively urban areas that are ethnicized and communalized as places of minorities."
End of quote.
These urban areas are unmistakably marked by yellow stickers and posters, for example, which inform passers-by that they are in a Sharia law zone and that the ban on alcohol, sex, music and gambling is enforced there, a thoroughly consequent tone that is struck, as the full-bearded people see themselves empowered by the state's delegation of power. Of course, these quarters were already recognizable before Tony Blair came to power, but not in such a self-confident manner. The Conservative predecessor governments had also pursued a back-to-the-basics approach to social policy, which referred the needy citizen first and foremost to his own resources and consequently threw immigrant descendants back onto their traditional clan and clan structures. However, this was not also the ideological guiding principle of conservative social policy. While this placed an individual, who was of course mostly powerless in practice, in the empty spaces of state social policy, New Labour dropped the ideological reference to the individual citizen altogether and elevated the particular microstates, parallel societies and ganglands that had emerged in the former industrial conurbations to official territories of social policy and the very dubious leaders of these territories to semi-official political actors. Deregulation would be precisely the wrong term to characterize this process. Rather, such territorialization brings a significant increase in regulation. The rules of the rackets are stricter and more tightly meshed than those of any classical administration. This is why Horkheimer's nightmare of a completely administered world without any freedom of movement becomes all the more real in the small-scale statehood of the communities, when gangs form always and everywhere and their territories resemble territorial cartels, the administered world emerges, Wolfgang Port therefore rightly observed. The London of the thoroughly anti-Semitic New Labour mayor Ken Livingstone was thus transformed during his term of office, 2000 to 2008, into a social democratic multiculturalist reprise of 1920 Chicago, an Islamic farce on the legendary cooperation between gangsterism and administration, in which the poor slumtown and the administrative racketville complemented each other. Just as in the 1920s, corrupt trade unions and ethnically organized, extended family districts gave rise to the Al Capone system and thus determined who was elected and who was not. In the past decade in London, ethno-clans and extended families with mostly Islamic backgrounds decided the success or failure of New Labour. What was called Slumtown in Chicago in 1920 is familiar to Britons under the significant name Londonistan, whose relationship to Parliament and City Hall was described in 2006. In a study by the hardly Labour-critical Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Quote, "It is indeed interesting to see how Labour administrations at local and national level in particular have subjected themselves to the logic of an essentially religious definition of the identity of immigrant groups and have themselves reinforced this with their policies. From the outset, Labour has relied heavily on traditional and religious leaders within immigrant communities, massively reinforcing their role. This policy has led to paradoxical alliances where fundamentally very different worldviews are interdependent in a way that is almost impossible to resolve. Today, in many constituencies in England's major cities, Labour is strategically dependent on the votes of Muslim immigrants, who can be mobilized relatively efficiently within the patriarchal authoritarian social and family structures of the Islamic parallel society."
End of quote.
It is inevitable that gangs will eventually become the only effective form of organization in places where the state itself has made gangs the organizing principle of its social policy, and the former Prime Minister is propagating the old autonomous slogan "Form gangs," albeit in set words. Equally inevitable, however, is that these gangs, true to their own organizational principle, do not provide a stable form of rule, but that the eternal struggle for territory and loot, the brutalized rebellion against confinement, boredom, and the old kapos create constant unrest. The new labor delusion that family, neighborhood, and religion can be used to keep the lower classes quiet, especially by isolating their Islamic core and leaving them to their own devices, failed in August before the eyes of the world public, for it was precisely in the self-proclaimed Sharia zones that the gang war, which was already constantly being waged within them, suddenly gained a new unifying front. The state-recognized top dogs, the community leaders, could no longer keep the younger ones in check. Indeed, this time their destructive will was explicitly directed not only against the weaker and non-participants, as is usual and commonplace, but also and especially against the fathers and uncles and their economic infrastructure of stores, small businesses, and snack bars. Ian Duncan Smith, the Conservative Labour Minister and member of the Parliamentary Committee on Gangs, confirms this unusual unification. The 200 or so postcode gangs, which according to official findings divide up the territories of London's poorer districts, would have cooperated for the days of the riots. Normally, each postcode gang fights the other. Now there is evidence that all the gangs kept a truce during the riots and exchanged information with each other, said the minister. Of course, this was not a formally agreed pact, but a spontaneously unified reaction to the violation of the informal sovereignty of the gang territories. What all small gangs have in common is their rejection of the big gang, as which the central state alone is still perceived by these young people. With the killing of Mark Duggan, the sovereign, which has become invisible in communal terms and has placed the bulk of social transfers in the hands of the so-called local councils, has suddenly emerged as an intruder and aggressor, an intrusion that was virtually repaid with a veritable wave of pillaging and looting. The gangs broke into the stores, and those who somehow wanted to join in the commotion stole afterwards, and were of course caught in large numbers. The gangs themselves were less interested in loot than in proving who in Tottenham and elsewhere controls property and physical integrity, who you have to reckon with, the gangs, and who you can't rely on, the cops. The boys' attack on the property of their fathers and uncles in no way harbors any potential for hope or change. On the contrary, any infrastructure appears to the looters purely as potential prey. And when this is actually possible, as in the days of August, the loot is seen as a well-deserved supplement to and compensation for the alternative of vegetating on benefits or with an income that is not even enough to finally be able to move out with parents or relatives. What no longer comes into view in this perspective is the contractually regulated sale of labor as an alternative means of access to the immense collection of goods that society's wealth appears to be. The young recognize their actual superfluousness on the official labor market harshly but realistically. And what is acutely true for them is potentially true for everyone. After all, nothing has fundamentally changed in the 3/4 of a century since the diagnosis made by Horkheimer at the end of the liberal era. Instead of being contract partners, the masses were now only faced with the choice of being beggars, objects of care, or immediate objects of domination. Wolfgang Port has also clearly pointed out the illusory nature of work and wages, which are in fact only allocation and gratification. People become pensioners and forced laborers in one. Their material existence is not derived from an unbreakable legal entitlement to remuneration for their labor, and it is perceived as a gift of grace, as a gratuity that can be revoked at any time.
End quote.
The plundering precarious worker intensifies this general precariousness by practically abolishing the fiction of exchange, which is in fact incorrect for him, and reproducing the already prevailing relations of violence. Market was yesterday, loot is today. What is right for the rackets ruling at the top is cheap for the gangs wanting to rule at the bottom. The formula of the big cake to be distributed expresses the changed consciousness. Even in relation to what they themselves produce, people behave as if it were stolen goods. Because they see the world as prey, they organize themselves into gangs. And because everyone does this, the boundaries between influence, coercion, and outright violence are blurred. So the members of those most worrying 120,000 families that Prime Minister Cameron identified as the core of the riots are merely the character masks of late capitalism, the sad vanguard of superfluousness, disfigured to the point of recognizability. Islam is the ideological reflection of this state of affairs, and not only because it is part of the traditional self-image of the majority of these families, as they come from Pakistan and Bangladesh, which was called East Pakistan until 1971. There are other qualities that make Islam the cultural core of the British ganglands, far beyond the question of mere religious affiliation of the inhabitants. These other qualities, which effortlessly transform the traditional religion of a late antique trade, slave-owning and predatory economy into a postmodern conglomerate of hate messages, also thwart the communitarian containment strategy. Yet it was precisely this strategy that promoted this mutation. New Labour quite deliberately pawned Islam as the core and role model of the communitarianization of the lower classes. Keenan Malik described this process quite empirically using the example of Bradford. the city with the highest proportion of Pakistanis in the UK and notorious since 1989 for a public Salman Rushdie book burning. The Islamization of Asian youths was reinforced by the new relationship between local authorities and mosques. Quote, in 1981 the council set up and funded the Bradford Council of Mosques and has since regarded this body as the voice of the community. This marginalized the secular radicals, the Asian youth movement disbanded, and gave new power to religious spokespeople. The secular tradition was literally wiped out and militant Islam became the mouthpiece of dissatisfied young people. This multiculturalism did not create militant Islam, but it created a space for it to flourish in British Muslim communities that it had not had before. It fostered a tribalized nation and undermined progressive aspirations in the communities.
End quote.
Economic and socio-political segregation, coupled with deliberate or negligent Islamization, created entities in Bradford and elsewhere in urban Britain that it would certainly not be wrong to describe as an inner Orient. The political and ideological valorization of Islam as an entree ticket for Asian immigrants and their offspring into an England of communities promoted a kind of separatism that is not only remotely reminiscent of the ideology of the American black Muslims, an ideology in which the desire for territorial racial segregation merges with set pieces from the Quran, but more than in the United States, where black Islam comes across as second- and third-hand synthetic esotericism and is therefore considered blatant blasphemy in the Islamic world, Pakistani youths are given Islam firsthand. Thus, the community borders not only mark simple territorial boundaries for postcode gangs and social politicians alike, but often also form a front on which the imperial claim of Islam, strengthened with all its inherent aggression and megalomania, rubs up against the secular Western state authority, once it manifests itself as such. This does not change the fact that gangland Islamism dispenses with ideological coherence. You can quote the Quran, but you do not have to be able to. You should not violate the alcohol and drug regulations, but this does not prevent many of the gangstas from doing so. This pseudo-Islamism is attractive precisely because it takes little more from religion than the pretentious, narcissistic self-aggrandizement of the believer, and combines it with all kinds of crude hate and power fantasies. The white and black lower classes are thus formally challenged to adapt, coalition, and mimicry. The triumph of hip-hop as music and lifestyle in the broadest sense was based precisely on this phenomenon. Its lyrics and customs reflect it very clearly. It is therefore absurd to conclude from the supposedly disproportionate participation of black Britons in the riots that the whole thing has nothing to do with Islam. Instead of, as Labour hoped, the faith contributing to the socially conservative stabilization of poor neighborhoods, a kind of ghetto Islam emerged that adopted its aggressive elements without integrating itself into the traditional father-uncle patriarchy. Instead, the superfluousness of the boys, learned over generations, promotes an exaggerated self-image, a superego that is actually reduced to gestures and therefore powerful in the imagination, whose radical chic draws on Islamic-style quotations. The fact that Islam is the most suitable of all denominations as a postmodern religion of the marginalized has to do with its pre-feudal constitution, Islam as the ideology of a late antique rentier and robber economy, with a traditional contempt for labor that goes with it, retreads but remains unchanged at its core, where social transfer combined with criminal appropriation contributes to subsistence, and traditional wage labor is as far away as the moon. The necklace with the Arab scimitar has thus replaced the ideologically neutral bling of the classic Capone gangsters. The gangsta really no longer has much in common with the historical type embodied on screen by James Cagney or Edward G. Robinson. While these gangsters once occupied real niches left by ethically charged production capitalism, namely the gambling business or the alcohol trade, their descendants in diffuse late capitalism are relegated to the administratively created safe spaces and storage areas for the superfluous. And so it comes as no surprise that the radical chic of the left behind is not reserved for English communities and American hoods, but is just as dominant among the corner cutters of abandoned neighborhoods in France as it is in socio-educational institutions and social democratic comprehensive schools in major German cities. The conflicts that take place in these very different storage areas are also similar in their structure. In all the cases mentioned, the pseudo-sovereignty of the gang territory is fed by the fact that the official sovereign maintains these territories, but no longer needs their occupants and therefore no longer cares how these occupants behave. An indifference that recognizing social work, respect initiatives and anti-racism can only flimsily disguise. Where the individual hardly has to deal with the laws and norms that apply in the rest of society, where misconduct has no serious consequences, such as the loss of an economic perspective, which does not exist as a worthwhile one anyway, deviance is inevitably heading towards a clash with property, as the only remaining possibility of experiencing a boundary at which one's own actions result in something other than understanding disinterest. But until it comes to the point where the police move in to at least protect the buildings from arson and the camps from looting, as in the English August, countless inmates of these areas have suffered an everyday life in which they were and are tyrannized, humiliated, beaten, and robbed. Superfluity, especially when their grievances are compensated for with Islamism, destroys the moral development of its inhabitants long before the neighborhoods do. Not for years has indie media stirred up so much dust, provoked so many outraged reactions on the net and in the press as with these lines posted by a certain riot on August 9 at 9:27 a.m., ultimate riots in London. Fighter groups control large parts of the city and let the insignia of capitalism and racist exploitation go up in flames. Now is the time for militant solidarity with our London comrades. For weeks now, still isolated fighters in Berlin have been trying to set flaming signs of uprising and revolution. Almost every night in Berlin, too, the capitalist wealth castles of the saturated racist majority society are attacked with fire and flame. Flaming signs in hallways, basements and attics in the inner-city districts due for yuppieization throw the first spotlights on the coming uprising of the racist and socially oppressed masses in Berlin too.
End quote.
Such omissions may be completely crazy, but they also have a fatal ideological historical consequence. For here the legitimate children of autonomia simply continue to write in the same way as the operaist radicals of the 1970s once did. And precisely because the result is so absurd, this absurdity also involuntarily exposes the origin of the still ingrained notions of delinquency as a substitute for revolution to criticism. This replacement became necessary when, during the crises of the 1970s, justified doubts arose about the radical left-wing credo that had prevailed until then, namely, whether the so-called mass worker should continue to be the focus of revolutionary agitation and hope, and whether the last battle could actually still be fought on the assembly lines of the large automobile factories. The centrality of the working class, Mario Tronti, which originally meant a political counterconcept to the reformism of the workers' parties, was up for discussion. Antonio Negri and others believed they had finally found a revolutionary answer to the inevitable farewell to the proletariat. André Gorz, in the squats and neighborhood initiatives of the late 1970s, the antagonists of the future were no longer to be called the working class and capital, but mass autonomy and the planned state. Their arena of struggle was to be the dispersed factory, a power structure that ultimately encompassed the entire city. With this turn, urban delinquency became the revolutionary self-creation of a diffuse substitute subject, which was to take the place of the militant worker of past eras in the equally diffuse factory. Proletarian shopping, theft and looting were now regarded as the wildcat strike of the city, indeed as an anticipation of communism. Quote, "The content of the project of workers' organization is determined by the program of direct appropriation of socially produced wealth. The appropriation by the workers is the practical recognition that a new revolutionary historical subject can today set itself the task of making communism blossom on its own struggle, on the characteristics of its own existence," Antonio Negri jubilated almost 40 years ago. In other words, the world as prey. Revolutionary theory copied and at the same time exaggerated the capitalism of the post-liberal era, which is disintegrating into mere rackets because it has socially annulled itself on its own economic basis. Negri's essentially vitalist ideal corresponds to this state, only that which is ragtag exists at all. Thus Fichte finally replaces Marx, the class struggle dissolves into free acts. An absolute subjectivity that is no longer subject to any limitations of reason and objectivity is derived purely from the ability to act, which must be practically proven. Society thus appears consequent in the autonomous tradition as a sum of struggles whose bearers and contents are becoming ever more arbitrary. The urban planning consequences of theory turned practical can be seen at the Berlin subway station Gorlitzer Bahnhof, where the monstrous Omar ibn al-Khattab Mosque now rises on the foundations of a supermarket destroyed by proletarian shopping in 1987. No, if we are to draw hope from anything in view of the riots of August 2011, it is certainly not from the energy of any of the protagonists, but rather from the rapid exhaustion of the struggles. Sociological findings, which generally state rather nostalgically and naggingly that social milieus are losing their binding power, or that individuals are less and less likely to firmly internalize the attitudes of their peer groups, seem to be proving true. Just as trade unions and choral societies are losing members, gang cohesion further down in society seems looser than ever. The riots have literally dissolved into nothing after 4 days, which is why the Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry into Gangs will hardly find anything even remotely comparable to what Martin Scorsese's historical drama Gangs of New York, 2002 addressed, how gang affiliations there, similar to primitive tribal affiliations, once determined all areas of the members' lives. In fact, what Wolfgang Port summed up almost 15 years ago in his gang study using Chicago as an example is probably also true of England. In the meantime, the gangs have become so hollow that empirical research no longer finds anything. With the ability to form gangs, the ability to rule generally declines, because statesmen and gangster bosses draw on the same basic qualifications. There as here, the strength that is necessary to inspire individuals for the collective seems to be lacking. Hopefully Port is right with this prognosis, because that would mean that the general weariness could even spoil the enthusiasm for barbarism. The recent riots in Southport and other former English industrial towns can hardly be compared with those of the East German Volksgemeinschaft in Lichtenhagen or Hoyerswerda. Rather, they are part of a tradition established by Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. In this tradition, society is broken down into family ties and communities. Subsidiary structures, as they say, were to take the place of trade unions and the welfare state. And so they did. Impoverished cities disintegrated into ethnic zones from which there is hardly any escape. And it's not just the notorious Sharia zones, where the sweatshop and drug economy is the only thing that flourishes. Immigrants can no longer free themselves from clan structures, while long-established residents, on the other hand, become much lonelier and thus more transfer-dependent, ergo even poorer, in their neighborhoods after the decline of the proletarian nuclear family, and tend towards white self-ethnicization. This is everyday life in Britain for those left behind. The so-called ghetto economy based on small-scale geographical segregation tends towards gang warfare, which gang members wage not only against each other, but against everyone who somehow belongs to the others. And so it is not always white police officers or fascist groups that trigger riots. Ethnic tensions also occur without their involvement, such as in Birmingham in October 2005, when gangs with a Caribbean migration background and those with a Pakistani background fought each other. Often the circumstances cannot be clearly categorized. The biggest riots before those that started in Southport were those that began in Tottenham in 2011 and also spread to other parts of the country. The original cause, the shooting of a suspected gangster by the police, soon became irrelevant. Schools were set on fire, the fire department was attacked, and in some cases there was even live fire from the ranks of looters. After all, it was mainly about looting, which is hardly surprising given that Tottenham is one of the poorest districts in the UK. According to social scientist Mike Hardy, this type of riot is not about culture, religion, or class, but about all those who feel excluded from society, and this feeling is by no means deceptive. The fact that fascist groups have continued to stir up long-standing hatred for weeks is frightening, but unfortunately not new either. The British National Party had already instigated this kind of thing in the 1980s and 1990s, albeit without the amplification effect that so-called social media has had. But it would be wrong to believe that the English Defence League, for example, is acting with the approval of a white-majority society. Those who want nothing to do with the bottom quarter of society do not appreciate plebeian riots, even if they are organized in the name of English culture. Nor is there any question of an anti-immigrant consensus. The bottom quarter of society does not want legal immigration because it burdens the labor market for precarious workers and depresses wages, whereas the top quarter does not want illegal immigration because it burdens the coffers and disturbs the idyllic southern English golf course. So there is no threat of fascism, but rather that things will continue as they have for decades. That is bad enough. For decades, the term winter of discontent stood for a horror vision with which the Conservative Party used to win elections in the United Kingdom. It signaled chaos caused by overindulgence towards the proletariat and a collapse of public order, such as that brought about by the trade unions with the widespread strikes of 1978-1979. For a long time, many Britons feared both more than the fact that they have hardly been able to afford dentures since the 1980s. This is now changing. The winter of discontent is currently a buzzword of reinvigorated trade unions, a re-evaluation of the term that indicates that the era of Thatcherism, including the social democratic Thatcherism of Tony Blair, "We are all Thatcherites now," his intimate Peter Mandelson said in 2002, is coming to an end. The spring of 1979 brought Britain a Zeitenwende that truly deserved its name. With Margaret Thatcher's election victory came the abrupt end of the British post-war consensus and with it the end of an era in which the Labour Party and the Conservatives had agreed on a social model that Labour considered to be the transition to socialism, while the Conservatives considered it to be its prevention, the latter accepted, in thoroughly reluctant fulfillment of concessions that had been given to the workers' organizations in the struggle for survival against Nazi Germany. Extensive state control of the economic framework, which was decidedly welfare state and Keynesian demand-oriented. In return, however, they prevented the complete nationalization of industry and large agricultural enterprises, which the Labour left had always demanded. The compromise between the two major parties put the trade unions in an extremely strong position. The Conservatives saw them as the lesser evil compared to the threat of nationalization. Labour, on the other hand, saw the virtually unlimited legal role of the trade unions in the factories as a form of workers' control in production, and not without good reason. Nowadays, and in any case hardly imaginable in Germany, The trade unions above all had the right to take unannounced industrial action without a ballot. This often gave local and company union leaders the right to strike over company matters without consulting the higher union leadership. This gave the local union representatives, the store stewards, a great deal of power and often led to much more favorable conditions being negotiated at local and company level than were provided for in the collective agreements. Secondary picketing and flying pickets were also tolerated customary law and meant that workers on strike in one company or industry locked out their suppliers at the same time. A good quarter of British workers were also employed in closed stores, i.e. in companies or offices where there was an agreement with the employer not to hire anyone who was not a member of the union. Over 50% of all British employees were unionized in the 1970s, and in the public sector the figure was as high as 90%. Against the backdrop of the great autonomy of trade union subgroups at company and local level, it was almost impossible to moderate crises from above, through cooperation between the government, employers and trade union leaders, i.e. to enforce so-called wage restraint. And this finally seemed to be called for with the major crisis that began in 1973 with the shock increase in energy prices. Great Britain in particular was hit hard by the crisis, and the country's entry into the EEC, European Economic Community, in the same year further revealed the competitive disadvantages of a high proportion of wage costs and insufficiently rationalized production, even though this entry was a logical reaction to the loss of Great Britain's privileged market position in the Commonwealth states. Falling exports and rising imports weakened the national budget and the British pound, and inflation began to gallop. It amounted to 26.9% in August 1975 compared to the same month the previous year. But no sooner had the Trade Union Congress, TUC, agreed a social contract with the Labour government of Harold Wilson and his successor James Callaghan in the same year, according to which the Labour government was to set the maximum wage increases, then individual trade unions and company organisations broke this agreement. In 1978, the umbrella organisation also refused to extend the contract after Prime Minister Callaghan demanded a fixed limit of 5% for wage increases. The TUC was responding to pressure from a furious rank and file. Public spending had already been capped in 1975, unemployment was rising rapidly, investors were sending the pound on such an unprecedented slide that Callaghan had to apply for an emergency IMF loan for Britain, which came with further austerity conditions. The sacrifices that wage earners had to make with the exorbitant real wage losses of the previous years turned out to be pointless. This is how the strike winter of 1978-1979 took its course. The decisive factor for the still very vivid memory of this winter in Great Britain was that the transport workers went on strike at the beginning of January, demand up to 40% more pay. The petrol stations ran out of petrol, especially as the transport workers went on strike at all the major ports. At the same time, there was continuous unusually heavy snowfall, which made large parts of the country almost inaccessible. Fuel and food threatened to become scarce in some places. Fuel shortages and blocked roads largely paralyzed industry. Shortly afterwards, the public sector unions went on strike, hospitals only accepted emergency cases, soldiers replaced striking police officers in the north of the country, and piles of garbage rose several meters high even in the poshest corners of London when the refuse collectors joined the strikes. Even the gravediggers went on strike, so that the mortuaries were bursting at the seams, which also provided macabre images. Although most of the trade unions subsequently achieved double-digit wage increases, the mood in the country had changed. On March 28, 1979, the Callaghan government lost a vote of no confidence by one vote and new elections were held on May 3, which the Conservatives clearly won under Margaret Thatcher, a politician who was fanatically committed to Friedrich Hayek-style neoliberalism. She did what she had promised in the election campaign. She immediately broke the post-war consensus and reduced trade union freedoms in the UK to roughly the same level as in Germany: compulsory ballot, restriction of picketing, ban on closed stores. But it went much further. It privatized what it could, especially on the British railroads, and undermined what it could not by promoting private competition. The National Health Service, NHS, and public housing in particular are still suffering to this day. The fact that this radically neoliberal program remained politically successful for almost 4 decades, despite the social misery it produced, particularly in the north of England, is not due to its own coherence. It benefited from the restrictions on the international movement of capital lifted in the 1970s and Britain's unrestricted access to the European single market. The Conservatives were thus able to leave it to the hand of the market to make traditional industries disappear along with their rebellious workforces. Even if police force was used to help during the miners' strike in 1984-1985, which affected not only the steel and textile industries but also car production, which Thatcher allowed
to collapse unmoved.
She was able to do this unscathed, as the UK was transformed into a kind of springboard into the European market during the same period, helped by broken trade unions as well as lax tax policy and the state's unwillingness to regulate. Not only did investment capital like to settle in London, but Asian companies soon used the UK as a final production site, which saved on import duties. And the once proud working class? Well, they were pushed into precariousness by deindustrialization and kept there under constant wage pressure. The collapse of real existing socialism ensured a steady supply of qualified workers from Eastern Europe with low aspirations on the deregulated labor market, which helped to preserve Thatcherism beyond the 1980s. The British exit from the EU, which was driven by the Conservatives of all parties, but by no means alone, might almost seem like a kind of punishment for believing their own lies. First and foremost, these were two, that the national market also regulates things in a liberal sense, although it is primarily the international market for capital and labor, and that it was the UK's own imperial past that had ensured that London had transformed itself from an industrial to a purely financial metropolis, although this was primarily due to access to the European single market. The conservative dream of a Singapore on the Thames as the centre of an Anglophone free trade zone has been shattered, but the calculations of many union-oriented exit supporters, if they had had any, would have worked out. Labor shortages in the transport sector of all sectors are leading to a sharp improvement in wages and working conditions, while strikes in the NHS are so widespread that strike participation here is approaching that of 1979. In any case, the prospects do not seem so bad that the second winter of discontent could finally end the era that began with the first. In mid-January 2010, the English Defence League, EDL, announced a joyous event on its website. Together with others involved, they had built up so much pressure on the government that the government could no longer avoid banning the Islam for UK group. What had happened? At the end of last year, the Islamist group, which has been active in the UK for years, announced that it would carry 500 empty coffins in memory of Muslims killed in the name of democracy and freedom, Taz, June 1, 2009, through Wootton Bassett, the place where the first public commemoration of British soldiers killed in action abroad traditionally takes place. The announcement by Islam for UK sparked a wave of outrage. According to the Daily Mail, a Facebook group set up to protest against the Islamist plan was quickly supported by 400,000 people, and Prime Minister Brown also expressed his horror and disgust, FAZ, June 1, 10. For the EDL, this was the high point so far in its fight against Islamists, which it has been waging since its inception in summer 2009, primarily with numerous demonstrations throughout the country, in which between 500 and 1,000 people, mainly from the soccer community, have always taken part. The EDL's appearances have met with widespread disapproval from the British public. There was and still is talk of a mysterious group, BBC, a BNP Light Times and fascist Jewish Chronicle, with a message of hate searchlight. The emergence of the loose grouping, which has long since also had Welsh Defence League and Scottish Defence League offshoots and as a child of the Internet Telegraph, claims to have around 3,700 members, can be traced back to an event that is closely linked to Islam for UK. On May 24, 2009, in the North London town of Luton, Islamists led by their leader Anjem Choudary once again protested on the sidelines of a parade of British troops. Choudary and his men, who were insulting a battalion of the Royal Anglian Regiment that had just returned from Iraq on signs as the Butchers of Basra, were attacked by a group of young Britons who called themselves the United People of Luton. This event is central to the EDL's self-image and the reason for its formation. In their self-portrayal it says, "The measure was full when the brave soldiers of the Royal Anglian Regiments returned to Luton from service in Basra, Iraq. Many of them had lost friends serving their country, just as numerous families had lost loved ones. On arrival in Luton, they were greeted by an absolutely disgusting demonstration by Muslim extremists. They called them child killers, butchers, and mocked their dead comrades. The police took more action against the patriotic people of Luton who stood in the way of these vile specimens instead of taking action against the extremists who shout their hatred of this country and our soldiers while enjoying the benefits we, the taxpayers, provide them." End quote. Two key words to understand the EDL are given with this quote. It sees itself as patriotic and as the voice of the common people, here called taxpayers. The EDL website gives a more detailed answer to the self-posed question, who is the English Defence League? Quote, "The EDL was founded out of frustration at the British government's lack of decisive action against extremist Muslim preachers and organisations such as Islam for UK and His Beauty Tahrir. Like many citizens of England and the rest of the UK, we have relied on our government for many years and waited. We have had enough of our government's ignorance of the problem itself. It prefers to promote a politically correct culture with leniency for jihadi preachers. Just a few examples of many should suffice to demonstrate the destructive effect of this indulgence on our lives. One of them relates to the fact that in a country that is largely secular but still officially Christian, nativity plays have been banned in many schools so as not to offend Muslims. Furthermore, halal meat, to which many objections could be raised on animal cruelty grounds, is offered as the only option in many schools. The extent to which Englishness is marginalized in England is illustrated by the fact that St. George's Day is no longer recognized in many towns and cities, and the St. George flag has even been banned by some because it might offend. This capitulation to Muslim extremists is spreading across the country. We think it is time for people to stand up for English culture against this Islamist onslaught and the political correctness that seeks to appease it. For this reason, in addition to our demonstrations, we will be protesting against any administration or local government that tampers with our traditional English celebrations, from Christmas to St. George's Day.
End quote.
The examples given are not far-fetched, they have been a British reality for years. And more absurd kowtows are being made to Islamism. The entry ban on Dutchman Geert Wilders at the beginning of 2009 is a particular highlight. As an illustration of the leniency and capitulation lamented by the EDL, the reason given for this unique incident in dealing with an EU parliamentarian within the EU was the threat to Britain's public safety. But isn't the EDL also a kind of jihadist preacher of the other side, basically just mirroring the Islamist attack, in the name of a nebulous English culture? Is this not a one-to-one reflection of the program of the xenophobes of the British National Party, BNP, which has recently become stronger and currently has 2 seats in the European Parliament for the first time? It seems to be anything but out of thin air to publicly establish an ideological affinity with the BNP and its leader Nick Griffin and to accuse the EDL of making statements that, like the BNP, are nothing but vulgar xenophobia. What does the EDL itself say?
Who can join them?
Is it like the BNP, which only allows those of indigenous Caucasian descent to join and which only includes light-skinned people among the down-to-earth British ethnic groups? Quote, some organizations and media reports have branded the EDL as racist, fascist, or far-right. All these accusations are completely untrue. We take an active anti-racist and anti-fascist stance. Furthermore, the EDL is apolitical and does not position itself on the right versus the left. We welcome members from all political spectrums. In short, we invite people of all ethnicities and religions to get involved in shaking our sleeping government awake, finally taking note of the jihad in our country and finishing off that which threatens the very foundations of the freedoms so dearly fought for us by previous generations. Too many English people are afraid to stand up and shout enough, for fear of being labeled racist. We hope we can change that.
End quote.
So unlike the BNP, no one is excluded on the basis of ethnic or cultural origin, including the 2 million or so British Muslims. However, according to the last major survey in 2005, 61% of them are in favor of the introduction of Sharia law among themselves and 88% insist that schools and workplaces should adapt to Muslim prayer times. It is therefore empirically validated when the EDL not only points to the fact that over 100 Sharia courts operate in this country, denying Muslims access to British law, but also identifies this widespread practice within Muslim communities as a major obstacle to Muslims being better able to integrate into normal British life. The fact that anti-fascism and British nationalism are not mutually exclusive, that patriotism even proved to be an effective antidote to fascism in general and National Socialism in particular, is something that British left-wingers still refuse to acknowledge today, not least in order to be able to remain silent about their own complete failure at the time. This culminated in the British left of Labour proving to be the most bitter, but fortunately largely uninfluential, enemies of Winston Churchill alongside the British fascists. At least since his famous blood, sweat and tears speech of 1940, which deliberately and with resounding success targeted the patriotic feelings of the British, it can no longer be denied that they can be compatible with anti-fascism. It was no coincidence that a speaker during the first EDL demonstration of 2010 invoked a Churchill speech from that period. And it was also no coincidence that this EDL member was a self-confessed Sikh. Our nation fought for freedom and it protected freedom in the Second World War. And today, freedoms are under threat from Muslim preachers and their sympathizers who want to bring Sharia law to this country, proclaimed one named Gurumit Singh. What is essential to this patriotism is the conviction that origin, as opposed to religion, is a negligible factor. At the same demonstration, an Afro-Caribbean EDL member, according to current usage, expressed this in his speech to the assembled demonstrators: I see the EDL as a defender of my interest in being able to live as a black person in a society in which skin color plays no role in the functioning of society. Just as Martin Luther King said many years ago in his famous, I Have a Dream speech.
End quote.
What patriotism necessarily blinds those responsible for the EDL to, however, is to understand the weakness in the fight against the threat to freedoms precisely as a legacy of British patriots. At the time of the Falklands War, A policy gained the upper hand that fundamentally called into question the functioning of society with its talk of individuals, who, instead of a society, would only be known. Thatcherism should therefore not be blamed for the denationalization of society, as the British left still does today. Rather, the accusation should be that it refrained from trying to reduce the uniform foundations of society to a common denominator at all. Thatcherism, of all things, finally cleared the way for the Friends of Communities, cultural studies and Sharia law, in which origin and skin color play a role that Martin Luther King never imagined in his wildest nightmares. A leading propaganda organ of these friends is the Antifa magazine Searchlight, whose makers share the same investigative zeal as those of the German Antifa-Infoblatt, AIB, but which, unlike the AIB in Germany, is widely respected in England as a serious authority. Searchlight finds it difficult to force the EDL into the prefabricated Nazi corset. This is all the more so as the paper, like the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, which is almost overwhelmingly powerful to the left of Labour in the relevant milieu, has refrained from any form of public criticism of Islamism since the London bombings of July 7, 2005, and instead focuses all its attention on combating Islamophobia. It is therefore not surprising that Nick Lowless, the editor of Searchlight, who is very present in the media, first exonerates the EDL to the BBC, only to then condemn them all the more harshly. Quote, "I can't say that everyone responsible for the EDL is a fascist or hardcore racist, but if you've seen the symbols, shouts and demeanor, then that's anti-Muslim, and that's hate speech."
End quote.
EDL demonstrations resemble the appearance of soccer crowds at a national team match. England flags are displayed en masse, people shout and sing for all they're worth, pose powerfully and cheer for England like their own favorite club, but there is no drinking during the demonstrations. 95% of the participants are fair-skinned men, many of whom, as is not uncommon in the UK, have hair less than an inch long and display the typical English working-class attitude. All social classes are represented, with the exception of the academic and university classes. The age spectrum ranges from 15 to 60, with 20 to 40-year-olds making up the majority. They don't know anything like a demonstration order, if only because there are no professional demonstrators among them. A megaphone is usually all that is needed for coordination and communication. Some of them wear black polo shirts with the slogan "No Surrender to Al-Qaeda" embroidered on the front and the words English Defence League on the back, with the name of the city they come from. However, there is no tendency towards uniformity. Minutes of silence are often held for the fallen British soldiers. They carry numerous signs and banners bearing the Red George Cross, which read, "Islamic extremists out, make Britain safe." It is not racist to be against Islamic extremists. Black and white unite. Islam will not dominate democracy and freedom. One nation, one law. No to Sharia law in UK. We are not the BNP and we are not racists. Sharia laws oppress women. We hate Nazis as much as we hate Islamic extremists. All races unite for freedom. Sharia laws stand for the execution of gays. Love England, hate extremism. Patriotism is not racism. They chant slogans such as "Muslim bombers off our streets," "We love our country," "Allah, Allah," "Who the fuck is Allah?" or simply England or EDL in the typical football chant. There's no question that they like to provoke and are happy to be provoked. But to call them agitators is simply malicious. They are probably best categorized as B-types, which the German police have introduced for soccer fans. This means that EDL supporters are neither always peaceful, which is what ANA would stand for, nor are they exclusively violent, C, so they are not averse to physical confrontations in case of doubt. If you try to define the EDL milieu in subcultural terms, it is difficult to do so because in the UK, more than anywhere else, the boundary between a Category B football fan and an average native British male is very fluid. The EDL's anthem, intoned by a band called Alex and the Bandits, which says, among other things, "I am England until the day I die," sums up this mediocrity quite well, if only because of the style of music, which you probably fall for on your own. EDL, as the song is titled, is an average piece of Britpop, as we know it well enough from the rowdy band Oasis, whose members are known to be superstars in the UK. Journalist Joan McAlpine, in one of her regular columns for the Sunday Times entitled "Fascism, Not Islam, is Our Real Enemy," explained that she would take part in a counter-demonstration against the EDL because fascism light, a la EDL, takes an approach that people in Britain would know only too well. Quote, "They have learned from the extreme left." Trotskyist groups with militant tendencies operated within the Labour Party in the 1970s and 1980s because they believed that the public was not yet ready for the creation of a revolutionary society. They relied on a transitional program that included popular ideas. It's the same tactic.
End quote.
Like many other media outlets, McAlpine explicitly cited Searchlight to justify her assessment of the EDL, research by the anti-fascist magazine revealed that several high-profile EDL members have links to the far right.
End quote.
Considering that the Trotskyists in England operated without question in the manner described by McAlpine, which did not lead to revolution, but did lead to a number of ex-revolutionaries serving as guardians of the politically correct culture today, and not only at Labour, the BBC or The Guardian, a look at the facts is overdue. Searchlight research is traditionally regarded as meticulous. Quote, a solid-looking middle-aged man has emerged as one of the key figures behind the English Defence League. Alan Lake, a 45-year-old businessman from Highgate, North London, sees the EDL as a potential street army forming against what he claims is the increasing Islamization of contemporary Britain. Indeed, Lake seems to have an interest in forging an alliance with any group that wants to do something about the strict Islamic rules, be it lesbian and gay organizations, other religions and ethnic groups, or defenders of free speech. Lake would like to keep the message short and sweet. Freedom of speech, democracy, equality before the law with no exceptions, and intolerating cultures of any ideology or religion.
End quote.
But didn't columnist McAlpine claim that Searchlight had discovered that several high-profile EDL members have links to the far right? Searchlight continues, the EDL is kept running by 15 key figures across the country. They coordinate with each other via email and social networking sites such as Facebook. While the group claims to be open to all, it is centered around the soccer hooligan network. In particular, it is supported by soccer gangs from Luton, Aston Villa, Queen's Park Rangers, Southampton, Bristol Rovers, West Bromwich Albion, and Wolves.
End quote.
Among the 15 main coordinators, Antifa magazine has identified 2 people with proven links to the far right. Quote, Davy Cooling, a 26-year-old known soccer hooligan. He is a BNP member and registered as interested in attending the BNP Red, White and Blue Festival in August. Cooling manages the Luton EDL Facebook page. Chris Renton, a BNP activist from Weston-super-Mare. Renton helped set up the EDL website. When his political links to the BNP became known, the EDL publicly distanced itself from him, but he remains a key player behind the scenes.
End quote.
However, Trevor Kelway, who Searchlight has identified as the EDL's official spokesman, can only be reported as saying that in interviews with the press he takes the line of portraying the EDL as a peaceful, non-racist organization, and that he has his postal address at Afro-Caribbean Hairdressers in Birmingham. The Antifa research is even more exculpatory in the case of the leader of the English Defence Youth, the EDL's youth group, Joel Titus, 18, is of mixed race and from Harrow. He is presented to the media as proof of non-racist orientation.
End quote.
What seems to be true is that the EDL is clearly serious about its claim to be open to members from all political spectrums. However, the value of a BNP membership that parades itself by actively supporting a group that has set itself clear liberal premises and is therefore hatefully labeled as multicultural by the party comrades of the National Socialist Movement 88 Britannia must remain the secret of those who think they can be EDL and BNP supporters at the same time. Renton and Cooling, who have been convicted as BNP members, will have to live with what their party leader Nick Griffin thinks of them and their engagement. On the BNP position on the EDL, Searchlight reports, BNP leader Nick Griffin has claimed that the English Defence League has been manipulated and directed by Zionists to instigate a race war.
End quote.
The statement referred to by Searchlight also says that the BNP has decided to treat the EDL as a proscribed organization and to take disciplinary action against BNP members who are active in the EDL because the EDL brings national and patriotic politics into disrepute. What the BNP has instinctively recognized as correct can only be seen as pure tactics by Searchlight due to ideological prejudices. An organization that sees itself as national and patriotic, precisely because it does not exclude anyone on the basis of origin or religion, and which, like the EDL, also believes in the Jungish values of freedom and democracy, is poison for the realization of the BNP dream of an ethnically homogeneous nation from which everything that is seen as a foreign body is to be removed. This is precisely what makes the EDL a dangerous adversary to Nick Griffin, who in reality wants nothing more than a war of the races, which he takes pleasure in instigating against a remote-controlled EDL in order to present himself as a clean man. The EDL is not only aware of this constellation, it is also up against 2 other fierce opponents in addition to the BNP. Members of the English Defence League have received death threats from 3 groups: Islamic extremists, white supremacists and misguided anti-fascists, it says on its website. These 3 groups were the main targets of an unusual action in Luton at the end of September 2009. Various media representatives were directed to a secret location where 16 masked EDL members were gathered in front of a banner on which "Black and White Unite" was written in large letters. To symbolically underline the anti-fascist and non-racist character of the EDL, a dark-skinned member with an extra white EDL shirt was positioned in such a way that his skin color could not escape any camera, and then burned a swastika flag in front of the journalists with the commentary "Long live freedom." To top it all off, they then held up a sign with a message written on it which, 3/4 of a year after the Gaza war, is probably the most heretical not only for the three EDL enemies mentioned above: "We support Israel's right to exist." This statement strikes at the heart of the British public's anti-Zionist consensus, about which almost everything has been said when one considers the events and facts that followed. Nick Griffin, of all people, who sometimes recommends his party comrades to read the left-wing Guardian to find out the truth about how George W. Bush could be manipulated by the Zionists, boasted on the BBC TV program Question Time at the end of October 2009 that he was the only political party to stand fully behind Israel's right to fight Hamas terrorists in the confrontation between Israel and Gaza. The only thing true about this statement is that the BNP was the only British party not to publicly oppose Israel's actions in late 2008/early 2009, and the only one to object to the anti-Israeli bias of the left-wing BBC and its notorious endless TV coverage of dead or injured Palestinian children. Griffin, however, had to be coerced by his own members to speak out on the Gaza war at all, only to declare in anti-imperialist fashion that this war had nothing to do with Britain or the BNP. The paper Israel's Gaza Affair states, "One of the core aspects of the nationalist philosophy is that Britain must keep completely out of other people's quarrels and wars unless issues of national interest to us give our government the right to interfere. Moreover, as nationalists who are not imperialists, we recognize the right of every other human being under the sun to seek to secure his own self-determination on a spot of ground which is his historic and spiritual home, on which it is the duty of every government of such a nation to protect its citizens from terrorism or oppression. The destruction of Israel would not return Islam to a peaceful slumber, but would only inspire it to radicalize itself and signal to a whole new generation of jihadi fanatics that the hour of final victory over the Crusaders has come."
End quote.
As the outpost of the Occident, Israel is ascribed the role it has always played in the anti-imperialist explanation of the world. Griffin has only reversed the signs. What is actually still regarded as the source of global evil, of which the Zionist EDL is only a proportionally smaller one, but of which the Zionist-manipulated George W. Bush is a major one, is now tactically being given the good side of doing the dirty work in the struggle of the Christian peoples against Islamic imperialism and thus, for once, being quite useful. Such a pro-Israeli view has not been limited to people like Griffin for some time now. Recently, there have been no fewer people in the UK who see themselves as supportive of Israel and critical of Islam under such auspices. It is therefore not known exactly how widespread such a view is among supporters of the English Defence League. What is certain, however, is that the fact that they are insulted as Zionists by left-wing, right-wing and Muslim organizations alike obviously does not affect their patriotic honor as Britons, unlike the supporters of the BNP. Otherwise it would be impossible to explain why at least one Israeli flag, which is obviously accepted in their own ranks, always appears alongside numerous British flags and Union Jacks at EDL demonstrations. The EDL also does not say that British troops should be brought home from Afghanistan and Iraq, which is the central foreign policy demand of the BNP in the name of nationalism and which differs in every detail from the groups to the left of Labour. The obvious real difference between the EDL and the BNP on the issue of Israel was summed up by a comment on an article on the EDL and its Zionist links published on the website of the openly anti-Semitic Muslim Public Affairs Committee, which is particularly popular among young British Muslims. In the Islamists Forum, a participant called BNP Racist expressed outrage at the EDL's public expression of solidarity with Israel. Quote, "I wonder how they can stand up for English rights when they are waving Israeli flags, because it's like people demonstrating for Palestinian rights are carrying Nazi flags."
End quote.
For their part, the Jewish organizations are driven by concerns that they could be associated with the EDL because of their pro-Israeli stance. The most important Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, as well as the head of the British Jewish Defence League, Jacob Press, make a point of dismissing the EDL as UK fascists or Neanderthal Anglo-Saxons. This makes them no different from the rest of the British public. A Jewish woman critical of Islam describes one reason for this averageness as follows: "In Britain, the idea of Jews as victims has all but disappeared. Islamophobia has taken its place today. While the Jews are defamed as Nazis, the Palestinians are seen as the new Jews."
End of quote.
This assessment is consistent with the findings of the Anti-Semitic Discourse Report from 2008, which was published by the Community Security Trust, CST, an organization for the protection of the Jewish population, which numbers between 300,000 and 350,000 people. Referring to the numerous calls for boycotts of Israel at British universities and by British trade unions, the report concludes, in summary, the anti-Israel boycotts are increasing the fear among many British Jews that their freedom depends on their influence or responsibility in or for an overseas conflict.
End quote.
One should therefore not wonder why CST Chairman Mark Gardner has only one concern when faced with the Israel flag at EDL demonstrations. Quote, "It is surely a very negative development for the Israeli flag to be used as a kind of metaphor for anti-Muslim behavior." Jewish Chronicle, October 9, 2009. For the British left, Nick Griffin's deception that the BNP is behind Israel is not only evidence of the closeness of the EDL and BNP, but also that racist Zionism is compatible with the rampant Islamophobia in Britain. One organization that is among the EDL's favorite opponents because it organizes protests against their demonstrations all over the country is Unite Against Fascism, ULEF. The group, which operates out of the office of former London Mayor Ken Livingstone, known for his fanatical anti-Zionism, and whose activities are coordinated by a handful of experienced cadres from Trotskyist front organizations such as the Anti-Nazi League or directly by members of the SWP, is widely regarded in Britain as a recognized institution in matters of anti-fascism and anti-racism. The organization owes its popularity to the widespread myth that the British left has historically earned special and decisive merits in the fight against fascism and National Socialism. Despite its total failure in the 1920s to 1940s, it succeeded in seizing the monopoly on anti-fascism and anti-racism and thus also in gaining the greatest possible authority to define what and who is considered fascist or racist today. The Antifa myth is based in particular on the myth that it was mass mobilization by the left that decisively prevented the rise of the Mosley fascists and thus spared Britain the fate of Germany and Italy. Not only do people today tend to ignore the fact that the Mosley fascists differed from the Nazis in their relatively low level of anti-Semitism and largely shared the anti-empire positions of the left. Even the events in October 1936 in East London's Cable Street, which are still celebrated today as the decisive blow against the Mosley supporters, in the course of which 100,000 people opposed a march of 1,900 fascists and on which the British left bases its Antifa fame, by no means had the result that everyone believes today. The Mosley movement gained new supporters in October and November 1936 and was able to expand its political influence in the eastern districts of London. It must therefore be emphasized that only the passing of the Public Order Act at the end of 1936 led to a lasting decline in the Mosley movement, as the general ban on paramilitary associations deprived it of a central instrument of its propaganda. In the case of the UEF, this sounds like this, directed against the EDL: "If we act together, we will defeat the Nazis," meaning the EDL, as we defeated the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s.
End quote.
In the calls for protest against the EDL, one text module appears again and again. Quote, "Islamophobia, intolerance against Muslims, is just as unacceptable as any other form of racism. It divides and weakens our society by making Muslims the scapegoats of a community, just as Hitler's Nazis deliberately did with the Jews in the 1930s. Today the EDL threatens Muslims, tomorrow it may target Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, black people, lesbians and gay men, tourists or Eastern Europeans."
End quote.
The scope of this lie can only be grasped if one also realizes that the entire SWP environment, including organizations such as the UEF, has a sympathy for Islam that surpasses the Mussolini euphoria of the American left in the 1930s. An eyewitness reports, the Marxism 2006 conference of the Socialist Workers' Party was dominated by the proximity to Islam. Countless speakers demanded, defend the Muslims and received loud ovations for it, with an enthusiasm that apart from Palestine, hardly any other topic was able to generate. Another speaker at the closing event was Azam Tamimi. He confessed to the hundreds of SWP supporters, "I've been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood all my life. I am a staunch supporter of Hamas. And I am proud of it." The reaction of the audience was a wave of enthusiasm. Almost everyone present stood up to applaud, loud cheers resounded through the hall.
End of quote.
The UEF also operates with such an orientation, and with great success. The UEF's list of supporters includes not only the obligatory MP George Galloway, who dreams of a new Arab Nasser, and his Respect Party, the first institutionalized grouping in which leftists and Islamists officially work together in one organization and which is supported by filmmaker Ken Loach and Nobel Prize winner Harold Pinter, among others, but also countless parliamentarians, trade unions and their officials, as well as bands such as the Chemical Brothers, Franz Ferdinand, and even the singer Morrissey. As if that wasn't enough, the full extent of the UEF's influence only becomes apparent once you realize that you can believe your eyes. The UEF was also supported by the Tory Spitzenkandidat, David Cameron. And that's by no means all the nastiness. Much to the delight of the UEF, in mid-September 2009 the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, John Denham, did not shirk from describing the EDL as a new form of Mosley fascism. The EDL, for its part, took this as an opportunity to give the Secretary of State a lesson in history and ideological criticism. Quote, "Sir, your description of the English Defence League as right-wing and fascist is mendacious. Fascism is a political theory that sees itself in opposition to liberal democracy and has close ideological ties to radical Islam."
End quote.
The question remains as to what drives the British leaders and their helpers in defaming the EDL and their awareness of the problem. The EDL has a clear-sighted answer to this. Speaking to the Telegraph, one member of the group spoke the truth about the sorry state of British society, which spares analysis for long stretches. "The easiest way to deal with us is to label us as Nazis."
End quote.
3 days had passed since the announcement of the decision on the UK's relationship with the EU, when the English team was defeated in the European Football Championship by representatives of a suburban, vegetation-less, troll-believing and reliably anti-Zionist small island state, home to a wool sweater-clad tribe proud of its genetic homogeneity. Germany, which has always been more inclined towards autochthonous mountain peoples than transatlantic trading peoples, went wild with enthusiasm. From young Unionists to anti-Germans, there was great joy that the snobs, egotists and eccentrics who had always sought their advantage in the EU, i.e. who viewed the union of European states in terms of instrumental reason rather than as a community of destiny, had finally been eliminated not only politically but also in sporting terms. We had never liked them anyway, the crazy individualists who, even in the remotest high moorland village, seem more urbane than any Berlin squatter, who ask strangers not first about their profession or ethnic origin, but about their hiking route or their favorite crime novelist, who do not confuse friendliness with communicative violence and distance with disregard. If something unforeseen happens, they cultivate their gardens instead of proclaiming the apocalypse. If a crisis occurs, they do not form gangs, but ensure that the worst danger is averted without any panic. Anti-national leftists agree with the Chancellor that such geocentric cherry-pickers, Transasy tea drinkers and backwoods rose growers should disappear from the scene sooner rather than continue to cause trouble for the European project. The fact that, following the soccer victory of the genetically homogeneous wool sweater people, the northern part of the British Isles, which has not even been halfway reclaimed by grumpy Karoroks in centuries and owes its only traces of civilization to English industry, is also moving from Great Britain towards the EU, is perceived with correspondingly malicious approval in this country. For this part of the country where plants thrive as rarely as thoughts is also a European region to German taste, no panorama whose quiet contemplation would not be disturbed by wind turbine parks, ecology, gender feminism and folk medicine as a regional reason of state, multiculturalism in every 100% Caledonian coastal town, and everyone, from the local politician protecting stone circles to the patriotic miner, is proud of their local limitations. However, the centre of support for the EU within the UK was not the province, but the capital. Not because it is a financial centre, however, but because the same clientele of anti-cosmopolitan global city dwellers who make life in Berlin or Paris so unpleasant now hold the majority there. Intellectual workers critical of free trade who despise any semblance of cosmopolitanism simply because it threatens to destroy the cultures that the post-bourgeois middle class lives from cultivating. The youth protest against Britain's departure from the EU fits in with this, as these are not simply young people, but members of the generation of cultural workers and freelancers who live off the supranational disposal of British liberalism. The Bremainers rallied behind them all those who benefit from the destruction of political and economic liberalism, parliamentary representation and individual freedom initiated by Germany and pursued by the EU, which, in contrast to the EU, was not only formally valid in the UK, but also in everyday life. The Brexiteers, on the other hand, did not simply give a voice to the disconnected, prejudiced petty bourgeoisie, but recalled what is progressive about Great Britain compared to continental Europe and is therefore not contrary to the European spirit, but rather to the EU's unruly spirit, the desire to shape state sovereignty, as its happy abolition seems a distant prospect, at least in accordance with comprehensibility and rationality, the refusal to bow to supranational rule-through, which is recognized in Britain even more reliably than in France as the legacy of German world interior policy. Finally, the self-evident fact that the EU is not a community of fate but a community of treaties and that treaties can be terminated. The EU may see itself, in the words of the Chancellor, as a family that can only be turned its back on at the cost of lifelong ostracism, but every British petty bourgeois knows better than any German what a treaty is. Even the resentment of British opponents of the EU against Eastern European internal migrants, which serves as an alibi to agitate against the islanders, points to liberalism enforced by society as a whole. It is only because of its liberal passport laws and its generous labor law and resident registration policies that the UK has become the preferred destination for European internal migrants. Polish immigrants in particular, who have risen through the ranks in their professions, often as craftsmen or engineers, have long since become not just imaginary but real competition for their British colleagues. The fact that Britons can be envious of their Eastern European competitors at all is not due to any EU policy that has been laboriously imposed on the islanders, but to the fact that the UK is still what Germany never wanted to be, a successful immigration country. If the British, unlike the Germans, neither set fire to refugee homes en masse nor roll out prayer mats in enthusiastic preemptive submission in the face of migration, this absence of delusional outbursts of emotion is seen by the Germans as a symptom of coldness. However, such coldness is closer to humanity than German warmth, which, whether in the form of hatred or euphoria, has always been the prelude to pogroms. The UK has not left the EU, but the other way around. The EU has been dismissed from the mutual partnership by the UK because it has proven incapable of meeting the standards of the partnership despite repeatedly being given the opportunity to prove itself. It is not the UK that is out, but the EU, and that means Germany first and foremost. However, since the European states enjoy national sovereignty, any state that is in agreement with the British can also resume the partnership with the United Kingdom by defending what in its history points away from Germany towards the West. It would be in keeping with British humor if Poland were to make the first move. In any case, the excitement should be limited as long as the guiding impulse is not provincialist resentment but the defense of what is better. Even G.K. Chesterton wrote against the Germans, "The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him."